Hi, Paul Seabridge here. Welcome to this webinar. So before we dive into the agenda for today, for those of you that are attending the webinar, you will have received an email from me with the agenda, so you already know what we're going to talk about today. But let me just take you back very quickly, firstly, to my first and second deal. So back in 2003, when I was growing up as a kid, my mother ran a small business, and many a time around the sort of dinner table after school, we'd be talking about her business, how things were going, challenges, etc., etc. And I suppose that's what piqued my interest into the world of business. So yeah, 2003, I was 19 years of age, and my mother had run this small business for many, many years. It was in the childcare sector, so she ran a chain of nursery schools. And from a childcare perspective, educational perspective, it was absolutely top notch. You know, it got the top rating from the sort of school inspectorates. It was compliant. It offered great care for children, all of that sort of stuff. So from that perspective, the business ran really, really well. But where it probably let itself down was from a business administrative point of view. So the business wasn't really making any money, but it wasn't losing money either. And after many conversations, I guess I'd sort of figured out in my head, having got a bit of business experience at this point, that maybe there was an opportunity to streamline, make it more efficient, sort out the business admin, make it a better business. So basically, did a deal with my mum to buy the business for £1. Took it over, and within a year, I'd streamlined operations, made it profitable, and sold it for five figures. And I used that as I suppose seed capital to do my first ever startup. So I then spent 7 years running a business, starting a business from scratch, and that then led me on to my second deal. Before I get into that, I suppose that's what got me into deal making in the first place. So I did my first deal. I did a startup, spent 7 years doing that. And after I'd done the startup and sold that business, I decided that after my sort of non-compete had expired, I went and did consulting for a client for a year. I thought, well, I'm going to do another startup. I'm going to do it. I basically built a recruitment staffing business. I thought I'm going to do this again, but in a slightly different sector. So got some offices, got some staff, started to build and work through that whole startup. And I guess this is what gave me my epiphany moment because I suppose when you start a business, whilst it can be fun, there's no brand name, you've got to create one, there's no staff, you've got to hire them, there's no cash flow, you've got to go out and find customers and create an operating model that works. And all of those things can be really fun, but they can also be pretty tough. I spent 7 years and, it almost didn't work out, but in the end we got there. And I sort of had this epiphany moment a couple of months into the second startup thinking, do I really want to do this again? 7 years, hard slog, no guarantee of success, got to create all of these things. Would it not be easier to find a business that I could buy? And even with a bad business that's not performing, it still comes with cash flow, it still comes with a name, it still comes with customer staff and all of those sorts of things that you have to figure out in a startup. And that's what led me to my second deal. And I went and leveraged this transaction, borrowed 300k to do the deal. And did that without having really any of my own capital or putting any of my own capital into the transaction. And that's really what then created that trajectory for me to go on and do another, well, over the past sort of 15 or so years, 108 transactions covering 32 different industries in 12 different countries. So yeah, let's dive into the agenda for today. So I'm going to talk about positioning, so how to position yourself as a credible buyer, even if you've never acquired a business before, how you go and find motivated sellers without brokers. So for those people that know me and engage with me will understand that I am very averse finding deals with brokers. Brokers charge fees. To justify those fees, typically they will overinflate the value of a business. Many of them work on a retainer basis. So to justify those retainers, they'll keep the seller in the process for as long as possible because it means that they get paid more. And the vast majority of businesses that are listed for sale don't sell. So I'll teach you today how to go and find those sellers directly before they even get to brokers. Once you've engaged with them, what you should say on the first call and how you should start following a sales process with them to coax them into doing a deal. Looking at the sort of typical objections that you get and how we build trust through those negotiations, how to quickly assess whether a deal is worth pursuing. So we'll talk about sort of deal structures, how leveraged acquisitions really work in the lower and mid market, and how you can structure offers that get accepted without overpaying. Well, then once we've got that deal agreed, walk you through the sort of term sheet negotiating tactics that we use in real transactions, how deals are actually funded, including low or no equity structures. And then once that deal's agreed and we've got to follow a process of due diligence, we'll look at what really matters versus what wastes time, and then the legal process explained in plain English. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been doing this long enough to understand the legal process. So I'll walk you through what that looks like. And then once the deal's done, I'll walk you through how we look at growing those businesses and how we de-risk it after acquisition. There'll be a couple of breaks today. So probably 2 hours in, we'll have a 10-minute break. Put the kettle on, whatever, and then we'll do another one or 2 hours later, and there'll be opportunities for Q&A. Please use the chat box to pop in any questions that you've got. I'll either address them as and when they pop up, or I'll try and deal with them all when we get to each sort of section. At the end of each section, when I summarise, I'll pick up the Q&A then, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So let's dive into it. So the first thing I want to cover off, and this is probably the area that most first-time deal makers probably get wrong, which is positioning. So if you Google yourself, what do you find? Ultimately, any outreach you do to potential business owners, the first thing they're going to do before they even contemplate engaging with you or deciding even to pick up the phone to you is they're going to Google you. They want to know who they're talking to. So really, what you want to make sure is you're positioned as an investor. A business investor looking to make acquisitions in their niche. So whilst it's okay to be sector agnostic and look at many different industries that potentially are ripe for roll up, the successful partnerships or the most successful partnerships that we've seen created in the past are when somebody focuses on a specific industry or niche, because they've either worked in it, they've owned a business in it, they already own a business in it, maybe they're passionate about it, maybe they've got contacts there. So my suggestion would be that you position yourself as an investor that's looking to acquire companies in whatever your niche is, not everything, just purely your niche. You want to make sure then that anything online reflects that. So your LinkedIn profile, so let's say you have a day job, you're a management consultant, your LinkedIn profile might position you as a management consultant working for XYZ company, explain all the things that you do. You need to scrap that, and you need to make sure that you look purely as a business investor. If you look like a management consultant on the side, does business acquisitions, it's not as compelling as somebody that looks like somebody that's buying multiple businesses and growing through acquisition. You want to make sure then any other relevant social media pages that you have obviously reflects the same. So LinkedIn is probably the biggest one, really. It's a business professional networking site, but if you're rolling up in, say, B2C consumer-based brands, then maybe you might be using other social media. So it's important that they reflect that as well. You might want to take it a step further and build a one-page group website where you focus on why you're rolling up in a particular sector, have a group brand name for that, with all the benefits of why companies coming together should engage. You want content to back this up, so we'll talk about this as we get later into the session today. But you want, regular articles, blogs, posts that create value for your audience. So it's not you selling yourself, explaining what you do. This is relevant content for your audience. So, if there's been some regulatory change, if there's some challenges in the market, if there's economic headwinds, then you might talk to your audience about how, as a business owner, you can navigate all of those things. So you want to make it value add. And we'll talk in more detail later on in the session, specifically on that subject about what content you can create. But if you create 2 pieces of content, post it on LinkedIn, post it on your personal website, post it into LinkedIn groups every week in, week out, over a 6-month period, that'll be 50 plus pieces of material that really will back up your profile as an investor. I'd suggest also producing your own one-page personal website that positions you as the same. And if this is your first rodeo and you've not done deals before, then maybe to take this one step further would be to partner with somebody like ourselves. And we'll talk about partnership opportunities towards the end of the session today, but you can also create your own advisory board, bring on board, people with the right background and credibility. Maybe they've got 30 years experience in your industry, and you can essentially use their credibility. And then if you've done deals, or when you've done your first deals, you can use case studies to also post content. So yeah, let's get into the next section.
People that aren't able to attend today, and I'll share this recording as well with you after the session. So if you want to dive back into it or revisit any part of it, then you can do. So yeah, let's go back into the slides. So you've positioned yourself in the right way, and we'll look at some examples of this in a moment as we get into some of the sourcing side of things. But yeah, one of the first things that you want to do is to get your SPV ready. So an SPV is a special purpose vehicle. It's a limited liability company that will be owned by you, incorporated in the country in which you wish to do a deal. So if you want to buy a business in the UK, it'll be a UK limited company. If you want to buy a business in Australia, it'll be an Australian limited liability company. If it's a US acquisition that you want to make, then it will be an SPV set up in your home state that you basically use as the vehicle to do your acquisition. Now, I'm not a tax advisor, and we might talk about tax and things like that in today's session. You need to get your own tax advice, but we're not looking at this setup initially from a tax perspective. We're looking at this purely as a vehicle to make your first acquisition. It's not you personally buying the shares of a company that you wish to acquire. It's your SPV that you own, and that is very important because it gives you that layer of limited liability. So once you've gone and done many deals, and maybe you want to move out of your country of tax residence, that there are various structures that could be used to minimise the tax liability side of things. We're not going to get into that in today's session, but fundamentally, the SPV is there to be limited liability and gives you asset protection. You would use this structure for every single acquisition, so you would use a new SPV for every single acquisition that you do, and the reason for that is you don't want to put everything in one pot, because if for some reason a deal goes wrong at some point, then you don't want the risk of that bad deal pulling down the rest of whatever it is that you've created. So we would always recommend using a new SPV to acquire the first company. You then set up a new SPV to acquire the second company, so on and so forth. And if you are looking to build a group and ultimately sell a larger group, then you can consolidate all of that structure later on. But from doing that initial purchase, you want to make sure that you use a newly incorporated SPV. So from a sourcing point of view, I mean, I think that this process of, buying, building and selling companies is very much a sales and marketing process. You're marketing yourself as a business buyer, so you're positioned in the right way. You're marketing yourself to potential business owners that you want to acquire. And then the sales side of things is basically a sales process of convincing that seller to sell you their business. So we're going to dive into some specific ways of sourcing. You'll notice that I'm not talking at all about looking for businesses that are actually listed for sale with brokers. But for people that know me that are watching today will know that I'm quite against sort of using brokers to source opportunities. And the principal reason for that is that, brokers typically charge upfront fees. To justify those upfront fees, they probably over-egg the valuation, and also they probably work on a retainer basis in most cases, which means that the longer that they can have that business listed for sale on their books, the more those retainers are worth to them. So you tend to find that, I certainly have found from the 108 transactions that I've done, only 3 were done where there was a broker involved. And I would say that those 3 were probably some of the most difficult deals I've done. And with hindsight, probably shouldn't have done them, certainly overpaid for 2 of those 3. So what we're going to focus on and talk about today is how do you source businesses that aren't actually up for sale, where you can get conversations going directly with business owners and not with sort of third parties or middlemen, if you like. So we're going to look at the fundamental ways to source. Now, everything that I'm going to talk to you about today, from a sourcing point of view, I'm going to demonstrate to you from a manual perspective. And the reason for that is so that you fully understand the process of how we source. But there are software tools that you can pay for that ultimately can automate this process. So I've recommended a few there. From our point of view, we use something called Dripify, which automates a lot of the LinkedIn sourcing. So essentially, if you imagine, instead of you going and looking up a business owner on LinkedIn and sending them a direct message, Dripify will actually do that on autopilot for you. Monday.com is what we use to manage our pipeline. So what that enables us to do is it acts as a bit of a CRM. So, for deals that we, may propose, and for whatever reason the seller says, no, this deal doesn't work for me, we can revisit that maybe in 6 or 12 months time. Monday.com, there are various automations that can be set up in there that can reach out to business owners, can email them, can put it in your calendar, and basically means managing the whole pipeline is a lot easier. A free version of that is Trello, not as advanced certainly, but when we first started out doing this, we used Trello as a free tool to manage the pipeline, and then we also use Instantly. Instantly is really good from an email sourcing point of view. So instead of you manually typing an email or copy and pasting and sending that email to a potential business owner, Instantly enables you to upload your data list of email addresses, and basically send out as many emails at whatever time of day you decide. And it will also monitor the responses. So how many people got it delivered, how many people opened it, how many people replied. And that can also help when you're sourcing, because if you're not getting the level of leads, or you're getting a load of responses that don't go anywhere, then Instantly can help give us the data to basically figure out which part of the process isn't quite working. And I'm a strong believer in actually having data, because that enables you to make better decisions. So there are software tools out there. All of those are not massively expensive. I don't know the exact costs today, because I have my team that set up and run all of these things, but you're talking maybe less than $100 to have all of those things in play that can automate things. So for the JV partners that we work with, where they use these sorts of tools, typically sourcing is a sort of 30-minute task every week, where you essentially make sure all your software is running, set up, it has its data, and then it does everything else for you, so that all you've got to do is manage the responses. But we're going to dive into the manual side of the process today, just so you can understand where we're getting the data, how we're putting the data together, the sort of messaging that we're sending out to potential business owners, and what that outreach looks like. So we're not. I mean, we with JV partners that we work with, we share 13 different ways of sourcing. The best ones for us are letters. So it might seem a bit old-fashioned, but writing to a business owner, advising that you're a business investor, you're looking to acquire companies in their space. Typically gets around about a 4% response rate if we're making sure that we're targeting the right data set, and we'll talk about how we do that as we go through the session today. We can then use email and LinkedIn. Email tends to be a bit more speculative, and if anybody's like me, where they get almost 100 emails every day, I tend to find that emails aren't as successful. Typically, we get a 1% response rate. And LinkedIn is the same. Not every business owner is on LinkedIn, but those that are, we typically tend to find a 1% response rate. With letters, there's a balance between probably doing volume, and we'll talk about numbers and what expectations you should have in terms of volumes and timescales and stuff as we go through the session a little bit later on. But there's a balance between doing volume, because it is a numbers game, and having a more sort of personalized approach. So what I recommend is, in your sector, you initially draw up a target list of 1,000 potential companies that meet the criteria, and we'll get into what the criteria needs to look like as we go into this session shortly. But you want a hit list of 1,000, and maybe you'll decide to approach that 1,000 list over a 3 to 4 month period. You did it over 12 weeks, you're looking at doing 100 letters, every single week to hit all of that data. And then I would pick my top 100. So these are, companies that are really ripe for acquisition, really meet your acquisition criteria, and you will ideally do a personalized approach to those top 100. So it won't just be a generic letter saying you're an investor looking for businesses to buy, you will personalize it to them. So it could be that you Google the company, you see that they've been in the news recently, maybe they've won awards, maybe they've won an accreditation, maybe they've expanded, maybe they've opened a new factory, whatever it is you can cite in that personalized content. You can do quite a lot of research into a business owner as well, and make it personal to them, not just about their company. So I'll give you an example. One of the companies that I acquired using this approach was I'd found out all about the company, and there was quite a lot of stuff in the public domain around, how their employees were really important to them. So they took all of their top performers on, exotic holidays. There was various award ceremonies, and one of the CEO and the owner of the business, she was a Leeds United football fan. And what I'd done was I'd Googled the Leeds United football manager. I'd taken a quote of something that he'd said around people and teamwork and the importance of all of that, and I'd included that in my personalised outreach, and sort of linked that to the message of why people's important. When we acquire a business, we really look after the staff, and that's really, really vital to the future of the business. And whilst that is quite time consuming, ultimately, if you break that down over a 12-week period or a quarter period, you're looking at doing 10 of those personalised letters a week. Each one possibly takes you 15 to 20 minutes. It's a standard template, but you've got maybe one or two paragraphs that you can personalize, and then you do the rest on sort of autopilot in terms of the sort of volume stuff. To back up and all of that, you also want to make sure that you're producing regular content. So this could be writing articles. So it's not you selling yourself as an acquirer of businesses. You really want to be creating content that resonates with your audience. So think about value add. It could be tips for how to sell your company, how to maximize the value. It could be something specific about the industry. Maybe there's some regulatory changes coming in. Maybe you can write an article about that. You can use things like ChatGPT to assist and help with that. If you aim to do 2 pieces of content every single week over a 6-month period, you'll have over 50 articles, and that's really quite important in terms of a positioning point of view, because you're not just doing your outreach and connecting with people, but when people Google you and look at what you're saying online, all of this leads back to you being positioned as a serious acquirer of business, and I suppose helps you stand out from others. So as I mentioned, you want your hit list, you want cold outreach, you want probably 1,000 to start with. You want to personalize around about 100 of those, and if you did that over a quarter period, then that is probably 2 to 3 hours work every week in terms of getting that sourcing done. So to break that down in sort of typical numbers for you, using that sort of 1,000 example, we're going to do 900 cold outreach, so it's 75 letters a week. You're going to do 100 personalized over the quarter, so that's 8 a week. That will probably give you around about 47 responses, so around about 4 a week. Not all of those responses will be positive. Some people might just email you to say thanks but no thanks, or I'm not interested, or the timing's not right. So you probably end up with 3 first calls. Majority of those will move into a second, more detailed conversation. From those, you'll probably sign some NDAs and ask for some financial information. And maybe only one of those will then turn into being a viable prospect that's worth following the process with. And over a quarter period, you're probably making 8 financial proposals, presenting 2 term sheets, and getting 1 deal agreed. You'll see there's a difference there between deal agreed now and deal agreed later. Sometimes when you're doing the outreach, particularly if you reach a business owner that is very much at the beginning of this journey and not necessarily done anything proactive, hasn't put the business for sale, has only really thought about it, then the timing might not work. They might not be motivated enough. So you might get a deal agreed from that initial 1,000 outreach, but you might have one that comes in 12 or 18 months' time, because you'll add it into the revisit or keep in touch pile. And over time, you'll break them down. They'll become more motivated, more realistic, maybe in their expectations. So that 1,000 should, if executed properly, give you, two deals, one initially and one to follow in 12 or 18 months' time. You'll see that the sort of time commitment there as well is around about 14 hours a week, and that's assuming that you're doing this process using some of the automated tools to save some time. So this is something that could be a full-time vocation, absolutely, but can also be something that can be used or can be managed over around other business commitments or the other work commitments that you may have. Most business owners are comfortable to speak with you during office hours, but equally will be happy to engage and talk with you out of sort of normal office hours. So it can very much be run around about other commitments. What I'm going to demonstrate to you now is a system called Endol. Endol is sort of connected to Companies House in the UK, and it enables you to source data that is pretty decent. So it enables you to approach companies of the right age profile of a business owner, of the right financial standing, that's going to meet the sort of leverage buyout type structure. There are other softwares available in other countries, so we'll talk about some of those as we go. So I'm just going to dive into come out of these slides, and I'm just going to dive into Endol so that you can see. Okay, so this is Endol. You can use this for free, or you can pay for it. Using it for free limits you to 100 searches in any one particular go. So you could certainly try this out for free, see what it looks like, and get comfortable with it. And then the paid version is around about £50 a month as a subscription. You want to subscribe to their Explorer a product, and this essentially enables you to put in criteria that gives us what we're looking for. So you log into their Explorer system, and then you have all of this here. So firstly, what we want active companies. We don't want anything that's in administration or liquidation or closed down or dissolved. We want purely active companies. You can then filter this further using type or size or age. We're not going to look at those specifically. You can have the age of the company. So we want companies that have been established for at least 10 years. And that's important because we want long established profitable companies, not companies that started yesterday. We then go back to people. So we want director's age. This is quite important. If we're doing leverage buyouts, what we're looking for is, probably business owners of the baby boomer generation. They started their business in the 80s or the 90s. They've built a successful business, and they're at now an age where potentially they're looking at some sort of retirement. Now, what we tend to find is that most of these business owners won't have done anything proactively to sell their business, so they won't have listed it for sale at this point. Some will, of course, but the vast majority won't. Your idea is to get to them before they've actually listed it for sale. Their kids probably don't want to buy the family business because they see how difficult it is to own and manage a small business. It's probably not big enough to be on the radar of private equity. Most private equity don't tend to get out of bed for less than 100 million. So that gives opportunities to people like me and you to approach these people, offer them a viable exit route. So we're looking for people sort of over the age of 55. So we add that as a criteria. Ownership, we want a maximum of 3 shareholders. Now, there's nothing to stop you approaching businesses with more than 3 shareholders, but in my experience, I've found that if it's an owner-operated business, just one shareholder, then ultimately you've got one person that's making the decision, one person to convince. Maybe it's partners, so maybe it's husband and wife, or maybe it's two individuals that own the business. 2 shareholders generally tend to be aligned if they're considering an exit. So essentially you've just got 2 people to convince to do the deal, and then 3 shareholders. We find that's the maximum because ultimately you've got 3 people with 3 different potential motivations, expectations. So ultimately, the more shareholders there are, the more people there are to convince. So let's focus our attention on looking for businesses with three or less shareholders, because there's three people that we've got, maximum 3 people that we've got to convince. Location, I'm not going to put this in here, but you can look for regions. So you could go for, say, the northwest of England. You could go for just a county like Cheshire, or you could go for the whole country. You can go national. So my recommendation would be that if you're if you're starting out on this journey, in the UK, I'll tell you a story actually. So in 2017, I decided I was going to do a roll up in the training industry, and I spent the whole month of April literally away from home, where I drove as far north as Edinburgh in Scotland, well, just north of Edinburgh in Scotland. I went to see training businesses in the southwest of England, in Cornwall, and basically everywhere in between. I think I racked up thousands of miles, lots of money spent on hotel bills aside from being away from home. And after a month of doing that and meeting 28 different training businesses, I didn't close any of those deals. And what that taught me was that I could spend a lot of time going and having nice meetings with business owners, but actually not get anything out of it. So one of the important things for me now, and what I've learned from that is a few things. Number one, we want to make sure that we're targeting the right companies in the first place. So, I'm not looking for people, under the age of 55. I'm not looking for a company. And I will have my initial meetings on Zoom. One of the things that you might want to do is, because as you can see here, just by entering that, over the age of 55, 3 shareholders, active companies, there's over 800,000 companies in the UK that match that criteria. So what we want to make sure is that we're using our time wisely. So one of the things that you might do is, let's say you live in Bristol, well, you might want to only look at companies in Bristol or in the southwest or within an hour or two drive of wherever it is you live. I would certainly start with that, because whilst my recommendation is to meet with business owners on Zoom, have phone calls with them, not meet them in person maybe until you've qualified them and sort of got some financial information and you're sort of on the way to doing a deal. Well, it would be far better to use your time traveling to local companies that you can buy, rather than to the other side of the company. So yeah, you can do regions, counties, postcodes. It's pretty detailed in terms of how you can filter that down. Then from an industry point of view, you can put in here your SIC code. So let's say we wanted recruitment companies. You can type in employment agencies, temporary employment activities, employment placement agencies. So you can see here, just in the recruitment industry in the UK, there's over 5,000 companies that are owned by the baby boomer generation nationally in the recruitment industry. What we can then do is start putting some financial information in. So ultimately, if a company doesn't file full accounts, then you're working off abbreviated accounts. So whilst there is the function to be able to put in EBITDA and turnover, if they're not filing full accounts, then if you entered that criteria in, then potentially you're going to miss out on targets that actually could meet the criteria. So my recommendation is to ignore that, unless you really are only looking for the larger transactions. And what we're looking for is current assets between 1 and 10 million. We're looking for net assets, 1 to 10 million. So whilst in most SMEs, current assets, it can be stock, it can be cash, it can be trade receivables. But in most SMEs, that current asset figure tends to be trade receivables. And the average SME in the UK, let's say they take 60 days to get paid, then most of that current asset figure will be invoice receivables. And whilst it's not a hard and fast rule, and there will be some nuances to this, if you get a company that's got 10 million in current assets, then if it's getting paid in 60 days, it says that maybe its turnover could be in the region of about 60 million. If it's got 2 million of current assets and it's getting paid in 60 days, then potentially it's got around about 12 million in revenue. So really, you're looking for businesses ideally between the sort of 3 million at the lower end, right the way up to maybe 50, 60 million at the higher end. Over and above that, it's still possible to do deals, but you are going to be competing with maybe private equity. And sub sort of that 3 million mark, potentially you're going to find an owner operated business where the business is very much reliant on its owner, and that carries quite a lot of risk. And if you are looking to do what I do, which is to not buy yourself a job, but to buy yourself a cash flowing asset that a capable management team can take care of, then really you want to stay away from owner operated businesses. So As you can see here, we've now got the list down to 349 companies. So baby boomer generation, maximum three shareholders, employment agencies with the financial criteria that we've mentioned. And then what you would essentially do is you would look up each one of these. So you'd open them all in a new tab. You'd be able to then and pull off the data of directors. If you wanted to, you could look up accounts and all those sorts of things. So I'll just give you an example of what that looks like. So here's one that I looked up earlier. This isn't a recruitment business, by the way. This is in a different industry. But when you open it in a new tab, you get the company name, the company number, the date it was incorporated. So this is a company that's at least 13 years old. You've then got some key financial data that is picked up from its most recent filed accounts. So the most recent financial accounts here are December 24, so just over 12 months old. Got turnover of 15 million, 2 million, almost 3 million in the bank, 25 employees, total assets of 9 million, net assets of 7, very low debt ratio of 16%. What we want to make sure is that the debt ratio for any company that we're looking at is as low as possible, ideally under 30%, but the lower the better. So this one would be quite a good target. It's certainly got a healthy balance sheet that potentially we could use to leverage. It's got some debt in it, but it's very relatively low, because in any leverage buyout, you're probably going to have to refinance any external or institutional debt. So in this scenario, there's not much of that there for us to be too concerned with. You then got the people, so you can see names of directors, dates of birth, or month and year. So it's a baby boomer business. If you click on ownership, you can see who owns the company, who is the main person with significant control. So this potentially could be one to approach, and whilst you can spend time getting the maybe the home address of the business owner, and you will always get a better response in that scenario, I probably wouldn't waste too much time trying to do that. I'd probably write into their serviced address is good enough for now. So you can get the address, you can get the name of the person, you can put that onto a spreadsheet, do a mail merge into your letter. You can then use that same spreadsheet to feed into the software tools like Instantly and Dripify to enable you to do the email and the LinkedIn. My recommendation would be to write to them a week later if you don't get a response, is to email them if you have an email address for them. And if you don't get a response from email, then a week later, follow them up on LinkedIn. You get no responses whatsoever, I'd probably drop them another email in 4 or 5 months' time just to say, hey, I wrote to you 4 or 5 months ago. I was interested in maybe making an acquisition. I'm still very much in the market to acquire. Would you be open to a conversation? So just because you communicate to the data once doesn't mean that you can't revisit it, and you can basically put that into your CRM to keep following up until you do get that response rate. So let's dive back into the slides. In fact, let's not dive into the slides. Let me just show you some examples of the outreach, the actual letters and the templates that we use for LinkedIn. So bear with me whilst I open that. Okay, so this is an example of the letter that we would normally recommend. So we've tried all sorts of things in the past. We've used corporate headed paper for our private equity firm. We've used different types of paper, quality envelopes, all of those sorts of things. This is the one that gets the most, the best response rate from all the things that that we've tried. So it will be from the desk of Paul Seabridge, my telephone number, my email address, their name and company address. You can see it's marked private and confidential. And then basically what the letter says is obviously regarding their company name. Forgive me for writing to you at your business address, but as contents of this letter are potentially sensitive, I thought it best to approach you this way in the first instance. I'm a private investor interested in acquiring a companies in whatever sector. From our research, it would appear to me that your company, XYZ Limited, could be of interest. And if you've already made an acquisition in this space, then you could reference that in this letter. I'd welcome a confidential discussion in the first instance. It cannot hurt to have a chat around subject on a nothing ventured, nothing gained basis and see how it goes. Please call, text, or email me on the above to discuss further. You'd sign it, and again, you've got all of your contact details here. So it's a relatively vague letter, and I think that that's probably what drives the response rates that we get, because it's a bit vague, not really sure what this is all about. Somebody's maybe saying they might be interested in buying my business. Let me reach out to them and have a chat. So that's an example of the sort of letters that we use. Let me show you what we do on LinkedIn and email. So these are the sorts of so LinkedIn, if you're not connected with them, limits, I think, the amount of text that you can put, I think, to 300 characters. So yeah, you can see these are far more brief, but I thought it'd be good to connect on a nothing ventured, nothing gained basis, as we're currently in the market for buying companies in their industry. Yeah, there's a few different scenarios that you can use there. And then from an email point of view, it's basically the same. It's the letter that we use, but copy and paste it into an email. Let's just quickly talk about other jurisdictions, because Endole is very much specific on the UK. One of the great things about the UK is that every company has to file its accounts, and even if they're abbreviated, you're able to identify who owns the company, their date of birth, their most recent financial information, and even if it's an abbreviated version, can give you a bit of a picture as to what the business is like. So that's great. If you go to Australia, it's a little bit more limited, and the same level of data is certainly not out there in the public domain, and it tends to be more of a manual process. Same in the United States as well. So in somewhere like Australia, I would probably go to Yellow Pages, and let's say I'm looking for construction companies in Queensland or Brisbane. I would look up all the companies in that space, and I get myself a list. And again, you can use software tools like ChatGPT to pull this list together for you. And what I would do is I would then go and look those companies up on LinkedIn. And whilst it's not a hard and fast rule, and it doesn't give you the same level of refinement as, say, something like Endole, is, let's say a company's got more than 50 employees, which you can identify on LinkedIn. You can look up the company, it'll tell you how many employees are there. A company that's got 50 employees is probably more likely to have the right financial profile to fit with what we're looking for than a company that's just got 5 employees. So I basically run that list through LinkedIn, look for companies with more than 50 employees. I would then try and identify the owner on LinkedIn. So I'm looking for job title, CEO, managing director, owner, founder, something along those lines. And where people put a profile picture up, you can get a sense for maybe how old they are, or you can look through their history. And if it says they've owned the company for 34 years, then potentially they're going to be in the right age bracket for you. So certainly not as much as a filter as something like Endole, but you can use that processing in the United States, in Canada, in LinkedIn, in Australia, where maybe the same level of data isn't there. So yeah, let's dive back into the slides. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things that you should be doing is creating relevant content and articles. So this isn't you selling, this is you providing valuable content for your audience. So as I mentioned before, if there's a regulatory change in your industry, then maybe you could write an article about it. If there's a key trend in your industry, you could talk about it. You could interview somebody in the industry. You could create video content off the back of it. You could write articles. You can post that to your website. And the idea is that you create 2 pieces of content every single week, and you can then share that in Facebook groups, in LinkedIn groups. So if you're looking to do a roll up in, say, the steel fabrication industry in Australia, then you could go and look up business owners in the steel fabrication industry. There will be groups on LinkedIn for that. One of the ones that we did recently was a roll up in the marketing services space, so digital marketing agencies. And there was a group on LinkedIn in the UK where there's something like 4,000 owners of marketing agencies, where we started to drop this sort of content into those groups. So not selling to them, just purely providing them with valuable content relevant to their industry. It gets you in front of them. It gets you building a relationship with your audience. And then it also gives you a reason to maybe message people. So you can say, hey, we're part of XYZ group. I don't know if you saw my recent article about XYZ, and then you can start and engage a conversation, and then you can steer that conversation towards maybe whether or not they're looking to exit. Other sources for deals. My first two deals were in my phone book, and yours probably is as well if you've not done a deal before. These will be people that you know. It could be a business owner that's in your phone book that might be of the right age bracket that could be looking to sell. It could be a professional that could introduce you to somebody that might be your target business owner. So, accountants, lawyers, other professionals that potentially could put you there. So probably one of the first things I would do is I'd probably look through my phone book and think, well, who here is a business owner that might be contemplating selling their business, somebody that I know. And then I'd write a second list of people that I know in my phone book that are maybe professionals that I could reach out to and pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm an investor now. I'm looking for acquisitions in this particular industry. Is there anybody that you know that you could refer? And just get the word out there. Suppliers. So once you've done your first deal, looking at tactical and strategic acquisitions, think customers, suppliers, related supply chain that you could potentially target, particularly if a business already has warm relationships with those suppliers. Social media is great. I would say probably more so LinkedIn than any of the other sort of social medias that you use. But depending on the type of industry you're going to, particularly B2C, would be probably quite good on something like Facebook, where maybe they might be marketing themselves to consumers. Networking and industry events. So these could be online, virtual, as well as sort of trade shows and in-person events. And also industry trade press, if there's any specific magazines or websites relevant to your industry that you're targeting, then writing regular content for those, getting noticed on those, talking to the key people behind those, trade press, journalists, etc., really to get your name out there. So we've done our outreach. We've used things like Endol and LinkedIn to identify the right profile of a business that we're looking to target. So we've sent them a letter, we've maybe followed up with an email, and we're now starting to get some response rates. Typically, responses tend to come in within a week to 2 weeks, but it usually takes around about 5 to 6 weeks for that momentum to build. So what do you say on those first calls? Well, we're actually going to dive into a sort of script, and I'll walk you through what those initial calls look like. But essentially, what you want to make sure is that, really the purpose of the meeting is to build up rapport, because once you've got rapport, you then gain their trust. And once you've got the trust, that's when you can essentially sell to them. And what you're selling here is you as a buyer, somebody that wants to acquire their company. So it should be a structured call. Probably the first one lasts somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. Starts off with a brief introduction. You want them talking to you more than you talking to them. You want to deliver some key messages, and this is really to act as a filter, because you want to start setting some expectations around deal structure, how you're going to fund the transaction, how it's going to be structured, the legal side of things. And we want to get these messages in, even in the initial call, even if it's just subtle, because really that acts as a filter, that if you say something to them that doesn't quite sit right, doesn't meet with their expectations, then it means that you're not going to waste time in subsequent meetings talking to somebody that was never going to be aligned to how you may structure a transaction. You want to really position yourself as a safe buyer. One of the things I find with most business owners is, aside from the financial components of any transaction, they're more interested in who the buyer is. So what are you going to do with the business? Are you going to change the name? Are you going to fire the staff? Are you going to ruin everything that they've spent many years building? Or are you going to be the polar opposite to that? So you want to position yourself as that type of buyer. And as time goes on and you've done more deals, you can maybe give specific examples and case studies of other companies that you've been involved in. If you don't have that credibility or experience, then you can partner with other people that have and trade off their experience. as I say, we want to deliver some key messages in those initial conversations around like how we structure deals, why we don't pay all of the money on closing, why we use seller financing, the legal structure, and then most importantly, with every single call, not just the initial one, but you want to agree what the next steps are and close and before that. So let's dive into it. Let me just pull up an example. Okay, so I'm not one for, let me just zoom in so you can see that a bit better. Okay, so I'm not a big one for using scripts. So whilst this is a script that you could use, I think really what you want to do is be able to talk freely following this sort of structure. And I guess it's practice makes perfect. The more times you do this, I've been doing this for 15 years, so I could probably read this to you verbatim without actually needing to read what's here on the screen. But really, this is really a script that I would sort of typically follow when I'm talking to business owners. So I'd start off by saying thank you for responding to my email letter, or however you communicated with them. The reason I wanted to speak to you is that I'm an investor. I'm looking to acquire a company in your industry. I'm part of OPC Capital. We're a global mergers and acquisitions firm, and we've completed over 100 transactions since we started back in 2010. So I'm interested to know if you're looking to explore an exit and sale from your business at the current time. Obviously, if you haven't done 100 deals and you're not part of our organisation, then you can tailor this accordingly. But really what we're trying to do here is build up that we're an experienced buyer. We've done lots of transactions and we're getting very much straight to the point because we want to know, are they looking to sell their business? I then, once we've ascertained that, I then ask them, perhaps you could give me a little bit of background to the business. Once you then got that background, you want to introduce yourself further. You can talk about, your industry experience, the people that you're working with, and then really you want to ask a lot of open questions, and you want them talking far more than you. You want to be listening more. Because you want to build up that rapport. And some questions may lead you to ask specific questions that aren't necessarily written down here on this script, but you use your judgment to probe further. But principally, what you're looking to do really at this stage is to build up rapport. So before we get into the next stage, let me just very quickly scroll down to some of the open questions. So here's some examples. Perhaps you give me a background to the business. Can I ask, are you in a process to sell the business? Have you engaged anyone to assist you in that process? Or is this one of the first conversations that you've had in this regard? You want to know, have they put it for sale? Have they had lots of conversations? Are they in a process? Or is this completely the first conversation? Because then you can tailor your approach. If they've not done anything about it and this is the first conversation, then your job is to educate them as much as building rapport, because you want to outline how the process works, how you're structuring deals. Obviously, if they've already gone through a process, maybe they've had offers, maybe they haven't been able to close a deal, and maybe they've experienced some pain as part of that process. So you can sort of position yourself more as somebody that isn't going to replicate that. So you would tailor your approach accordingly. And so, if they have done something about it, you might say, well, have you received much interest? Have you had any offers? Why did you not accept any of those offers? What feedback have you had? How long have you been in this process? And you can see, whether they're frustrated, whether they're tired of the process, whether it's early on. When you sell the business, is there somebody already in situ that can take over from you, or do you think a new owner would have to take your place or recruit somebody? And if you don't want to buy yourself a full-time job, then ideally you want to be buying a business that comes with a capable management team that isn't reliant on its owner. So once the owner retires, done the handover, leaves, you've got somebody in place that can run the business, and really that's the purpose of that question. Have you given thought to how long you may want to be prepared to be involved in a handover? And this is part of the setting expectations. So this is one of the key messages that you may want to deliver. So, regardless of what they say, what you might say here is that, normally we ask a business owners to do a 6 to 12 month handover. First off, we learn the business from you. Then we spend time building the relationships with staff, customers, and suppliers. So initially this could be full time, but as time ticks on, reliance on you becomes less and less. So usually in the first 7 to 12 month period of us taking over, we move more to a sort of weekly meeting or regular phone calls rather than being operationally involved in the company. Other questions to ask, aside from the financial components of a deal, is there anything else that's important to you? And really, you're wanting to try and ascertain what's important to them. Is it a buyer that's going to look after the business, isn't going to fire the staff, isn't going to change too many things? Have you given thought to what you want to sell the company for? Most of the time they won't tell you, but if you don't ask, you don't get. So I'd be trying to, fish out really what they're looking to try and sell the company for, whether they've got any expectations. There's many different ways that you can ask that question, and we'll get into those later on. What timescale have you got in mind to selling the business? Is there anything that's driving their decision, or is it just more open-ended? So once you've sort of solicited that initial information, what I'd be then doing is sharing some final key messages and agreeing the next steps. So what I'd be saying then is, thank you for sharing that information. Let me tell you a little bit more about us, the type of buyer we are, and how we structure a deal. And then if you feel positive about that, we can work out what the next steps are. First thing for me to say is that the reason we want to buy a long-established, profitable company in your industry is that we want to use it as an anchor to grow, principally through acquisition. So ideally, we want to make tactical and strategic acquisitions in this industry to form a larger group. And when you start putting companies together, you can drive a whole host of benefits, whether it be economies of scale or buying power. And we see ourselves more as a facilitator than an operator, in that we'll bring the tools, the resources, and most importantly, the capital to the table to enable a business to grow, working with the existing management team to grow the company. So it's not about changing things or trying to reinvent the wheel. We won't be changing the name. We won't be firing the staff. In fact, quite the opposite. We're more likely to be hiring people as we grow. It's really about building upon what's already a well-run, profitable, established company and taking it to the next level. Let me tell you a little bit more about how we structure deals. There are many different ways to value a business, but what I've found in my experience is it really boils down to what you as a willing seller will sell for and what we as a willing buyer are prepared to buy for, and whether these things are aligned. Generally, we tend to look at the profits of the company and what profits the company is making, and we base the deal either on the most recent financials, or maybe we take an average over a period of time. And we then look at the balance sheet to see what assets and liabilities we will acquire on closing, and we add these two things together. Typically, we don't pay all of the purchase price at closing. We'll pay a meaningful sum, but there's always going to be a degree of some stage payments. And the main reason for this is that there's always a risk that when there's a change of ownership, customers may go elsewhere, suppliers may get jittery, key staff could leave. And what we want to make sure that you're involved in a handover so that we can protect this goodwill. The first part is to understand how the business is run. The second part is to hand over the relationships with staff, customers, and suppliers. And gradually, as it's done orderly and efficiently, we ultimately, get to a point where we, understand the business and we hand over those relationships. And then whilst you may not need an incentive, ultimately, if you've got a vested interest in that you've not had all of your money at closing and some of it is to be paid in the near future or conditional on certain things, then the more likely you're going to be to stick around and help us work through that handover effectively. So essentially, you've in that first call, you've explained that you're a buyer. You're going to build upon what's created. You want a business that comes with a capable management team. You want them to be involved in a handover. You've told them that you look at the profits and the balance sheet to value the business. You've told them you're not going to pay all of the money at closing, and there's going to be some sort of deferment, so that you've set those expectations. So if for some reason they say, well, no, I want a much higher price, I want all of the money, I'm not prepared to be in a handover, the business is reliant on me, but I still want to leave, then it acts as a filter, so they're not going to progress to the next stage. So wind the clock forward maybe 3 or 4 meetings time, and you're ready to make that financial proposal. The fact that you've told them how you structure deals, how you value companies, how there's going to be some sort of seller financing, means that it won't be a surprise when you get to that offer proposal. And then it's really about closing them for the next step. So the next steps, Mr. Business Owner, if you're interested to progress, will be for us to place an NDA and a confidentiality agreement in between us. And this enables us to share information with one another, and then we can arrange a more detailed discussion. So shall we organise an NDA after this call? I can have it emailed to you, or if you have your own version that you prefer to use, we're happy either way. And what you want to do is you want to close them, that they're going to review that NDA, they're going to get it signed and sent back, and we're going to organise a further call before you leave that conversation. So I'd probably say something like this. So if I get an NDA to you later today, when do you think you can review it and return it? And usually this might be a few days. And once you've got the timescale, I would say to them, so let's aim to have the NDA signed by both of us by the end of the week. And then perhaps you can suggest a convenient time for Zoom Teams meeting, and we can discuss things further, and maybe we could do that next week. So you sort of closing them for that next step, that next meeting, that next point of action. There's no point having a nice conversation with no action off the back of it. The action here is to send an NDA, agree a timescale to get it signed, and book in a further, more detailed discussion. So that's the first call. Let's go back to the slides. So the second meeting is going to be more detailed. It's very much a repeat of the first. It's just you're going to get into a bit more detail, not just in terms of understanding the business, building up the rapport and the relationship, but also diving into more detail around those key messages that you want to deliver, that are going to act as a filter. So that really, when you come out of that second meeting, you want to make sure that they are very much a motivated prospect. They're serious about this, and you believe, based on the information that you solicit, that in principle, they're motivated enough, they're realistic enough, and you think that this is a business that's worth buying. So let's have a look at the second call script. So as I say, second call is very much a repeat of the first. You should be listening more than you're speaking. And again, you want to get across the key messages, which you can do after you ask specific questions that steer the conversation into that. So other questions you could, really you're diving into more detail. So more questions on the business itself. Who are your main customers? How long have you been doing business with them? What are your main suppliers? Who are the key people in your management team? How long have they worked for you for? Are there any gaps in experience or skills within the management team that we may need to plug should we acquire? What does the future pipeline look like? Are there long-term contracts or business that they're about to win? Do they have an in-house accounts department? What does that look like? Or do they work with an external accounting firm, or both? Where do they see the growth opportunities for the business or the buyer? Of course, you can ask many, many, many more questions, but really, what you're trying to understand is more about the business itself. So, who are they doing business with? Are there any customer concentration issues? So, for example, they say, well, we do business with XYZ company and they're our main customer, and potentially that flags a risk. Or if it's more diverse, then that might be better for you. Motivation questions could be, why is now the right time to sell the business? What do you want to sell the business for? Have you given any thought to what you'll do with the proceeds of the sale? Do you have any certain amount that you're looking for at closing for anything specific? And have they looked at what they may do with the proceeds of the sale? Are they looking to invest it? If they are, what are they looking to invest it in? If so, what on and what sort of returns do they expect? So, one of the questions to ask is, what do they want to sell the business for? And if they say, well, don't know, I'm not going to tell you, whatever, then you've asked that question in a different way. If they say, well, I'm looking to maybe pay off my mortgage, or maybe I want to buy a holiday home, or maybe I want to, buy some real estate and do some passive investment, you can use those answers to gauge a rough idea as to what they might then be looking for. Key messages that you want to deliver in more detail this time round. So, when you ask those questions, once you've got the answer, you would link in, once I've asked them, what do you want to sell the business for? Is there anything that they're looking to invest in? Is there a certain amount they need at closing? Once I've got the answers to that, then I'd probably deliver this message here around valuation and deal structure. So when we spoke last time, you mentioned that you've given some thought to what would make a deal work for you from a practical sense. And what I wanted to do now is just dive into how we can get to that point where we can make you a financial proposal. So the way we would normally structure something would be to look at the profits of the company. Usually we take EBIT or EBITDA, so earnings before interest and tax, or earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. And either we take the most recent or we take an average and we apply a multiple to that. Then we'll look at the balance sheet to see what assets and liabilities we would acquire on closing. And we add these two things together to give us an overall purchase price that we will present to you. In order for us to get to that point, now that we've got an NDA in place, if you were able to share some financial information, we can give you a ballpark idea of what that looks like. So it won't be a formal proposal, it just means that we can have the whole financial conversation early on in the process. So if we're not aligned, then neither of us waste each other's time if we can't get past that financial component. So would you be happy to share some information so we can get to that ballpark? We do like to have that conversation probably by meeting 3 or meeting 4. Let's get some financials. Let's give them a ballpark idea. And then if they're positive about that, then we can obviously progress them through the process. If we're not aligned, then there's no point, having further conversations, and it probably goes into the revisit pile until they become more motivated. Deal structures, justifying deferred payments and succession planning. So, again, once you've asked certain questions, you could say, so you mentioned you've already got somebody in place that can take over from you, or you might say, you mentioned that you don't have anybody in place to take over from you, and we need to take, we need to recruit somebody. So what I would mention here is this key message. So I mentioned last time we spoke that when we structure a deal, we never pay all of the purchase price on completion, because there's always a risk that when there's a change of ownership, customers can go elsewhere, suppliers can get jittery, or maybe key staff might not like the new owners and end up leaving. So we don't want any of that to happen. So even if there is somebody in place running the business, we want you to be involved to ensure there's an orderly handover. If there isn't somebody in place, then we want to work with you to identify a successor and have you involved in helping us select that right person. So with some of the purchase price left to pay, we paid. This gives you a vested interest in helping ensure we protect this goodwill together so we can build upon your legacy. So you've really just reiterated that message there, that you're not paying all of the purchase price. There's got to be some seller financing and the reasons why. So wind the clock forward to when you're making that financial proposal and you're making that offer. It won't be a surprise that there's some sort of deferment. Another key message to deliver is around deal structure and funding. So I think it's important for me to tell you, Mr. Business Owner, how we structure the deal legally and how we fund it. Firstly, we'll use a newly incorporated limited company that ultimately I'll be a stakeholder of. That company will buy the shares of your company. In the US, we call shares stock, so not to be confused with inventory. So it's either a stock purchase or a share purchase. We want to buy the shares of your company, and it will sit as a wholly owned subsidiary. There's two elements to funding the deal. Firstly, we'll inject new debt into the holding company and also your company, which will provide the initial payment on closing. The second part will be the element of seller financing with the deferred payments that will be structured with an appropriate loan note and security. So again, when you come to make the offer, it's no surprise that you're using a newly incorporated SPV. It's funded by debt secured against the balance sheet, and there's going to be some seller financing. And timescale. So we're keen to proceed. So if we get to a point where we're all aligned on a deal structure, normally it takes 3 to 4 months from negotiating the deal to completion. And during this time period, we'll need to undertake due diligence. Our due diligence isn't too laborious in that we'll give you a checklist of information. You provide all of that remotely. We can review it in a secure data room. And this enables us to look through the legal, financial and commercial aspects of the transaction and the due diligence. And we engage lawyers to draw up the contracts and the legal paperwork, and then we raise the funding. All of these things run concurrently. Typically, it takes 3 to 4 months to conclude, and we find that the best way to work together proactively we find that it's best to work together proactively to work through this process swiftly and efficiently, as no one wants either party to drag their feet. So you sort of manage their expectations that once we agree something, we're going to go quick. One of the things I've learned is time kills deals. So we want to make sure everybody's aligned to being efficient, proactive, responsive, so that we can get that deal done. So let's dive back into the slides. So now we're going to move on to objection handling. So what are the typical objections that we get and how do we handle them? So fundamentally, the objections that you'll get throughout this process are, number one, the valuation. They want more than you're offering. Number two, they want more at closing. Number three, they're not happy with seller financing, or the deferred element is maybe too long, or they want more upfront, a shorter period to pay out the deferred. And really what's important when we're handling these objections is really to initially show empathy. So, you understand their concern, and then you offer some sort of rebuttal to try and overcome that. So let's dive into those objections. So part of objection handling is about actually delivering those key messages as a sort of filter when you're having those first and second meetings. But if they still come up, then you can show empathy by saying, well, thank you for telling me that, Mr. Seller. I understand your opinion, and then you can dive into some sort of rebuttal. So valuation, if I'm honest, doesn't tend to come up too more. It tends to be more around, they want more upfront or they want a shorter deferred period rather than the overall valuation not working. So really what I'd be talking about here, if it was a valuation issue, is that I'd be reiterating, the whole willing buyer and willing seller argument. So there's many different ways to value a business. But what I've found is that it ultimately boils down to what you as a willing seller are prepared to sell for and what we as a willing buyer are prepared to buy for. The challenge with SMEs from an acquisition point of view is that they're very high risk. There tends to be a lot of dependence on the owner. Even if there's a capable management team in place, ultimately it's the owner's name above the door. It's the owner that started the business. It's the owner that takes the risks. It's the owner that drives the strategy more so than the management team. And research shows from Harvard Business School that the average sale price of an SME is 2.5 times its most recent profit. And most businesses that typically tend to be listed for sale don't sell. So really, you're just sort of citing typical, multiples. It's a myth that small businesses sell for 8, 10, 12 times multiple. There are a handful of sectors that may defy the normal logic, but for the vast majority of sectors, 2.5 times is the multiple. If I analyse our deals from the last 3 years, and we're talking double-digit number of transactions, the average multiple is 2.5 times. 2.52 times its EBITDA, and the average payout period tends to be over 3.5 years. That's the average from ourselves. And look, if you can't meet their expectations on valuation, then it goes into the revisit pile, and you call them in 6 or 12 months' time. Circumstances may change. They may become more realistic. They may have had other offers. They may have had other feedback from a process that ultimately points to, your business is only worth 2.5 times, not the 4 that you thought. The next 2 objections of not having enough money up front, or the deferred payment period being too long. This really tends to relate not specifically to them actually needing more money or wanting a shorter time period. It really boils down to trust. The reason they want more upfront is because they don't trust that you're going to pay them the deferred when you say you're going to. So ultimately, if they can extract more money from you upfront, then that means that they're reducing their risk. And the same with the deferred payment period. If they're getting a shorter payment period, then they're reducing their risk as they go. So one of the things that you can use here is using logic and explaining how you're funding the transaction. So you're using debt, and that debt needs to be serviced. So if they've got $1 million worth of EBITDA, free cash flow, then out of that $1 million, you need to pay them their seller note. You need to also pay the bank, and you'll be able to put this all onto a spreadsheet. And we'll talk about this when we get into the analysis stage a little bit later on in the session today, about how we analyze the debt servicing. But ultimately, you can literally pull up a spreadsheet and show them what's affordable and what's not. So if I shorten the deferred period, it's not affordable. If I pay you more upfront, the balance sheet doesn't support that level of debt within the business. And obviously, one of the things we don't want is to get into a position where we're over leveraged and we can't afford to pay. We want something that's affordable and workable for all parties. Another objection potentially you may get is a handover period. Most of the time, sellers are absolutely fine with doing a handover period. You might ask for 12 months, and most of the time they'll say they're happy to do longer. But if there's something that's driving them to sell the business, maybe it's a health issue, for example, then maybe they might have an objection to being involved in such a lengthy handover period. So it's really trying to figure out why they might not be prepared to do too long of a handover period, and see if you can make that work. So that's our objections. Let's go back into the slides. So as part of the negotiations, generally what we tend to do is, so we have the first meeting, we build the rapport, we close into the NDA. We then have the second meeting where we find out more detail about the business, their motivations, what a deal structure might need to look like. And then really when we're getting to the third meeting, we're probably getting to a point where we're starting to share some sort of ballpark ideas as to what a deal may look like. So overall, how much upfront, how much deferred, what the deferred period may look like. And it's really at this point then you're going to sort of really figure out whether we're aligned. So given that you've had several meetings with them, you've set their expectations, then when you come to making that financial proposal, they should be generally aligned and there shouldn't be any surprises. They already know about seller financing. They already know that you're funding it with debt, that the balance sheet needs to support that debt, that future cash flow needs to support the debt and the seller financing. But that's not to say that they're going to not try and negotiate with you. So we call this the deal pie, and essentially there's a few different things that you can use to, negotiate, depending on the jurisdiction. If they're sat on surplus cash, then potentially you could use that cash to towards the deal. So most transactions tend to be on a cash-free, debt-free basis. But if you're in the UK, it's not uncommon for a business owner to, over many years, build a successful business, make decent profits. And every year they'll take out a dividend that will support whatever it costs them to pay the bills, live the lifestyle that they want. But if they're making more profit than actually what they need to draw as an income, then it's not uncommon for a company over 10 or 15 years to build up a significant surplus cash balance. And the reason for that is ultimately if they took all of that cash, then they'll be clobbered for tax. Dividend tax rates in the UK are 40% plus. Whereas if we actually structured the deal to pay out that cash on completion, and it's structured in the right way, then potentially they'll only pay capital gains tax on that cash element. So on £1 million worth of surplus cash, for example, taking that out as a dividend, probably you'll net somewhere in the region of 600 grand. But if we structure this right and they benefit from business asset disposal relief, then they'll only pay 14% capital gains tax. So essentially they'll net almost 850 grand. So a significant difference, significant tax saving. So potentially you could use that tax incentive to pay out surplus cash as part of the transaction, which could maybe increase the amount that you pay out at closing, or overall as a overall deal structure. That same doesn't exist in say somewhere like Australia or the US, and cash generally tends to be treated in the same way. So there aren't any tax benefits, but you can still position it in a way where cash is part of the transaction, even if there isn't any tax benefits. It's more about positioning the overall deal. We've already talked about leveraging the business, its assets, to generate cash to pay them. Earnout is quite a good one. So, let's say in meetings you've had with a business owner, they've told you, well, we're just on the cusp of winning this new contract. We've got a really strong pipeline. Next year will be the best year ever. Most business owners tend to tell you that because, they're trying to position the future and the potential of the business. So, if they want more, in terms of a fixed price, you might not really deviate from that valuation and that overall amount that you'd be prepared to pay them. But what you could say in negotiations is, well, you told me that you're going to win this contract. It's going to uplift the profits by this amount. So if you can deliver that in your handover period, then we're prepared to share a percentage of that. So essentially it gives them, a higher valuation, a higher payout, but they've got to deliver something for you. Another thing that you could do would be actually to leave them with some equity. So, if you're going on a buy and build strategy and you're pitching that, you're going to put several companies together, drive an overall valuation of an enlarged group at a much higher multiple than you're acquiring them for today. Well, if they are left with 10, 20 or even 30% of the business, then potentially when you create your own exit in 3-5 years time, that equity potentially could be worth more than what you're paying for the company today. So that could be something that you could do. We've already mentioned seller financing and deferred. If there's a sort of recurring revenue business model, then maybe you might pay a royalty or commission of future sales revenue as a sort of ongoing sweetener. If you already own a business, then a merger could potentially be something that you could use, and again leave them with equity, so they end up with equity of not just their existing business, but also any other business that you bring to the table. And then if you're looking for additional cash, well, other areas to go outside of sort of traditional financial institutions and leverage could be suppliers to the business, customers. I did a transaction in 2021 where the main supplier to the business was very supportive of the company, and actually saw the potential for growth. So they actually provided funding for the business, not actually to support the transaction, but to support working capital, which enabled us to pay out more of the free cash within the business. So they essentially stumped up some cash that helped make the deal work. Other things, once you've built a group, you can potentially refinance and get revolving credit facilities and go for more senior debt across a group. There's other things, we won't get into that in today's session, because we could probably do a whole session on listed, taking a company public, doing private placements, bond raises, and stuff like that. We're not going to cover that in today's session, but yeah, essentially you get the gist of a deal pie can be used to tweak the deal and make it more viable for them. Let me very quickly show you a sample NDA. So you've had that second meeting. You're now ready to send them an NDA. This is an example of the NDA that we use. Very simple one-page document. We're not precious about this. If they would prefer to use their own, fine, send their own. But we have this sort of standard template, and essentially all this is really a document that says, we're going to share information with them, they're going to share information with us, so it's a mutual agreement. The information we may share is case studies of the deals that we've done, etc., details about our management team. The information that they're going to share with us is principally operational and financial information, and this enables us to make sure that we're not going to disclose it to anybody other than our professional advisors, and also for them. You get them to sign that, send it back. Fairly straightforward agreement. Back to the slides. So we've got to a point where we've built up a good relationship with the seller. We've set some key expectations around how we're going to structure the deal. We've put the NDA in place. We've got some financial information. We're now ready to start thinking about how might we structure a deal. So before we dive into the specifics of, I'll actually show you an analysis of a live deal. This is sort of typically where we start from a sort of leverage point of view. So generally what we want to make sure is that we're not using more than 70% of EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax and depreciation, to service the debt. And the debt includes the seller financing. So whatever we may borrow from a sort of asset-based cash flow lending point of view, we want to make sure that plus the seller note doesn't exceed more than 70% of available EBITDA, which basically gives us a little bit of room for leeway. Let's say we take over and then all of a sudden a key customer leaves, or turnover drops, or costs rise, and it eats into that EBITDA. It means that we've got some leeway that if EBITDA does drop significantly, we can still service the debt. And that's one of the things that lenders are really going to be looking at. Is not just that you can make everything work on a spreadsheet. They're going to want to stress test different scenarios. So what if costs rise? What if profits drop? What if margins change? What if it takes longer for customers to pay you? They're going to want to know that you've sort of modeled all of that, so that they can see, that you've considered all of those things, and sort of B, what the worst case scenario would be if any of those things came to fruition, that you can still essentially pay the people that you need to pay when you're supposed to pay them. So the key areas of leverage that we would look at is real estate. So typically this tends to be in more industrial businesses. They might own the factory, the premises that they trade from. We could leverage between 50 and 70% of the real estate value. Or we could do some sort of sale and leaseback type transaction where essentially a business owner gets 100% of the real estate value. Typically, that type of funding, it takes 3 to 6 months, because you tend to be at the mercy of the banks, real estate lawyers, and they need to check the title, and depending on the jurisdiction, that can take time. Invoice finance is probably the easiest form of funding to put in play for a leverage buyout. You can typically borrow up to 80% of invoice receivables. So let's say a company, sends out a load of invoices to its customers. Let's say all of those invoices together total £1 million. Potentially, you could take up to 80% of that, so 800 grand, as an advance payment, and you can use that to fund the transaction. And typically, that takes about 2 to 3 months to arrange. Plant and machinery, so again, tends to be in more industrial businesses. So let's say you're an engineering company or a manufacturing company, you might have expensive kit within your factory. You can borrow anywhere between 33 and 75% of the liquidation value. Liquidation value is essentially what a lender would say, this is what the equipment is worth if we had to do a fire sale. So if the business closed down tomorrow and we had to sell everything off within the next week or two at an auction, that's what the liquidation value is, not necessarily what the open market value or replacement cost value would be. And typically that takes 3 to 4 months to arrange. Stock and inventory finance is possible, but it tends to really only apply to big ticket only. So think about if you're an automotive business selling cars, you can probably get stock finance. But if you're selling, plastic widgets from China that cost $1 a go, then that sort of inventory isn't really fundable. But where it can play a part is maybe post-transaction to support working capital. And then cash flow lending tends to be up to 4 times EBITDA less debt, including any seller deferred. And generally, cash flow lending tends to go as part of any asset-based lend. So you wouldn't necessarily get cash flow lending as a standalone. It tends to be coupled with some form of asset-based lending. So yeah, let's have a look at a real example. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to zoom in so we can all see this a little bit better. So this is a very simple analysis template. I mean, clearly with a deal, we would get into a lot more detail, but for purposes of making that ballpark financial proposal, so we've had our second meeting, we've got the NDA, we've looked at some financials. We'll use this spreadsheet to analyze maybe what a deal may look like for them, so that when we go back and have that third meeting, we're saying, look, we've got a sort of ballpark idea as to where we may sit from a deal perspective. Let me share that with you. All of the data to make that proposal is on this spreadsheet. If they are positive at the end of that call, yes, there might be some negotiation and some tweaks, but nothing material. Then we would go and model this all in far more detail. But initially, this gives us enough information. So what we're looking for initially is we'll analyze the P&L, the income statement. We'll then look at the balance sheet. We're then going to look at working capital, and then we're going to look at funding, which is over here, and how what it costs to service the funding. So let's look at each different section. So normally what we do is once we've got the NDA, we'll give them a shopping list of information. So that tends to be 3 years statutory accounts plus recent management accounts since the year end to include a balance sheet. And also, whilst not essential, if they've got any forecasts, then that's always helpful, but it's not essential for us to analyse the deal. And then all we do is we extract the data from those statutory accounts and we input it into this model. So what was their revenue for the past 3 years? What was their gross profit? We can then see what their gross profit margin was. So we can actually see over the last 3 years in this example, gross profits have declined slightly, not massively, but still they have essentially it costs them more to trade than it did 3 years ago. What their operating profit is. And we then can work out EBITDA and EBIT. So interest, depreciation, amortization. This gives us EBIT and EBITDA. So in this example, in 2025, this company made 1.5 million of EBITDA and 1.2 million of EBIT. Whether you buy the business as a multiple of EBIT or EBITDA will be down to you. We used to buy businesses on a multiple of EBITDA. We've actually, in the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, decided to change that to EBIT. And EBIT is quite important because let's just use an example. Let's say you're a trucking business. So, you're a transportation company. You transport goods and services goods and products for companies around the country. Fundamentally, you invest in trucks. Those trucks may last for 5 years. They drive to the moon and back, and then you have to replace them. Every year you can depreciate the value of that truck. And essentially that depreciation is a non-cash item. So it adjusts the fundamentally the EBITDA. But I say that depreciation is just future capex. That you might write down the value of that lorry by 100 grand, which essentially you offset against your corporation tax. But that 100 grand is just you buying a new lorry in 5 years' time when the lorry is driven to the moon and back, and at the end of its useful life, and you need to go and purchase a new lorry to carry on doing business. So the reason why we don't use EBITDA as a multiple and we use EBIT is that really is for us, and I'm not saying that this is the right or wrong way of doing it, it's just the way that we do things, but basing it on EBIT means that we're buying the real profit of the business rather than some sort of adjusted value using depreciation, which potentially doesn't necessarily always factor in capital expenditure. If there are any add backs, then we would put these in here. For me, what lenders are more concerned with is what you're actually putting on your tax return as a company, rather than making some figure overinflated. Any good accountant can make a profit look better or worse. So one of the things we tend to find is that some add backs can be realistic. So let's say they've got their wife on the payroll who doesn't play a role in the business whatsoever, or they're putting sizable amounts into their pension, which when you own the company, they won't be doing anymore. Their wife won't be on the payroll anymore. They won't be putting money into their pension. So that would be a genuine add back, because the normalized profit under your ownership will not include those items. But where this can come unstuck is sometimes they'll add exceptional items in. So, for example, they might put bad debt in. So let's say they've had a couple of customers go bust, and that's cost them as a bad debt that they've had to write off. Well, in reality, my view is that that's a real cost to the business. Just because it's an exceptional item, every year there's likely to be a provision for bad debts because that's just how business works. The other thing as well is that maybe they might add back their own costs, so director salary, but they might not factor in a replacement cost. So if you need to recruit a new MD to run the business once the owner leaves, well, that MD is going to come at a cost, probably at a higher cost than the MD may be paying themselves. So that needs to be factored in. Or even if there is an existing MD in place that's running the business, and the owner's going to leave and then they won't be paid a salary anymore, it's likely that that MD that's going to take over from them is going to need to have an adjustment to their salary to compensate them for the additional responsibility of fundamentally running the company. So add backs I would be a bit subjective with, and take a view on them as to what's included and what's not. Really, you want to make sure that add backs probably don't account for more than 20% of the adjusted EBITDA. I had an IM through last week where the actual declared profits were 300k, but the adjusted EBIT was 1.5. Well, a lender's just going to look at that and laugh because, essentially that's saying that, all of these wild adjustments shows that the business actually isn't operated that well. There's a lot of hidden costs, and probably bring into question the credibility of their actual accounting. So you want well-run, profitable businesses, that are recording their financial statements properly. They're not running personal expenses within reason through the business, and it's all above board and reasonable, and any normalizations are realistic. We then look at the balance sheet. So we look at the net assets of the company. We would then deduct from the net assets any items. So typically that will be intangibles. They may well have capitalized certain items. So the goodwill within the business, maybe they made acquisitions, maybe they've developed their own software. And whilst that might have a value to the business, from a funding perspective, it doesn't. You can't fund against intangibles. So we would normally reduce the balance sheet value by whatever intangibles, if any. Directors' loan accounts typically tend to be grossed up, so can be quite a contentious area, but really we want to make sure that if they owe the company a certain amount, that that's extinguished on completion, and either they need to repay that as cash, they take it as a dividend, or we gross it up into the consideration. So if there was a director's loan account, it would reduce the balance sheet by whatever that amount is. If there's any intercompany positions, we need to understand what's happening with those. Are they going to be written off? Are they going to be repaid? What impact does that have on the balance sheet? Deferred tax is another one. Essentially, it's a future liability, so it's unfair for the buyer to take that on board. So again, we would normally adjust the balance sheet accordingly. So in this example, we've seen that there's 4.5 million of net assets. There's a deferred tax liability that we're knocking off. So the adjusted net assets is 3.7. We're then looking at working capital. So we've got current assets and current liabilities, creditors, and stock. And this model will tell us what their average debtor days are. So it's taking them about 121 days for their customer to pay them from receiving the invoice. And they're paying their creditors, so their suppliers, within 100 days. Their stock and inventory, they're churning every 35 days. So we can see where working capital is sort of tied up. If there's surplus cash in the business, then we can adjust the working capital for any surplus cash that might be taken as part of the transaction. And what this shows us here is that the normalized working capital with the cash is 1.8, but if we adjust for cash, the normalized working capital is 867k. And either you're buying on a cash-free, debt-free basis, or you're buying on the basis that enough working capital will be left in the business. That's down to negotiation. My advice would be to make sure that there's enough working capital left in the business. You're doing a share purchase at the end of the day. It's a moving target. You're agreeing a purchase price, and you expect that the day after completion that the bank account isn't emptied and there's enough working capital in the business to support operations moving forward. In my model here, we've got an average 3-year EBITDA of 1.9 million. We've got a 3-year average EBIT of 1.7, and then depending on how we want to structure the deal, it could be that we base it on the most recent, or we take an average. In this example, we're going to take the most recent of 1.2. We're going to apply a multiple of 2 times that figure, which gives us a goodwill value of 2.5 million. We've got adjusted net assets of 3.7, which gives us a total purchase price of 6.2, which is the goodwill at the net assets. We can then pay them 4.2 million on closing. We can pay them a deferred consideration of 2 million over 4 years, which gives them an equivalent multiple, adding all of that together to 4.93. So we're paying a 2 times multiple of the profit plus the assets and liabilities that we're going to acquire, gives us the equivalent multiple of 4.9, because the purchase price is 6.2 divided by the 1.2 EBIT that the business is based upon, or the deal's based upon. That gives us an average of 4.93. In terms of how we've come up with that initial consideration, we've had a look here now at the funding. So we can see that they've got receivables. So customers owe this business money to the tune of 2.5 million. They've got some existing funding secured against that in this example. So it means that the net value that we've got to work with is just over 2.5. We're going to say in this scenario, we're going to borrow 70% of that, which gives us 1.7. They've got real estate, which we're going to borrow against. We're going to borrow 50% against the value of the real estate, which gives us 270k. They've got plant and machinery, because this is an industrial business with a little bit of finance outstanding, which needs to be factored in. We're going to borrow 50% of that, which gives us 1.5. They've got cash, which we're going to pay out as part of the transaction, so another 900. There's another little bit of debt in this business, which we need to reduce off. Let's say professional fees, so accountants, lawyers, etc., amount to 200k, less the existing funding, nets to the seller 4.2 million. In terms of then what this costs to service, so invoice finance is going to cost us about 201,000 in interest. The real estate is going to cost us 21k in interest per year, 13.5k in capital repayments, and plant and machinery 121k in interest, 303k in capital, which basically means that we've got a total debt servicing to financial institutions of 661k. We've then got a seller note of 2 million, which is payable over 4 years. So we're going to pay capital. The capital repayment of that is just over 500k a year. So when we add all of that together, it comes to 1.165 in terms of debt servicing against an EBITDA of 1.5 million, and we want that DSR, debt servicing ratio, to be less than 1.3, and in this scenario it's 0.7. So we can see there that deal is pretty decent. We're paying them more than half up front, the deferred is over a reasonable period of time, and the debt servicing works. And then in negotiations, we could probably pay the deferred over a shorter period of 3 years, and we might be able to leverage up some of these assets to a slightly higher amount. Maybe we could get 80% on invoice finance, maybe we could do 70% on real estate, maybe we could do 75% on plant and machinery. So essentially we could increase that up front maybe to 5.3, and the debt service ratio is still doable at 1.2 million against 1.5 million of EBITDA. So fairly straightforward, basic analysis. If we propose that to the seller and they're positive about things, then we would obviously do a much more detailed financial model, and I'll show an example of that as we move through the process. So let's dive back into the slides. We're going to be coming up to a break as well shortly, probably 10 minutes or so. We'll aim to have a 10-minute comfort break. Okay, back into the slides. Okay, so offer proposals. So we'll do this after the break, where I'll actually show you an example of a specific offer proposal. So um, yeah, so far we've identified our target list of companies that we want to approach. We've done the outreach, we've had the initial conversations, we've moved them to a second call, more detailed call. We've got the NDA in place, we've had the financials, we've then done the analysis, and we've gone and had another conversation with them. That third conversation is really before we get to the formal offer proposal. So you'll do your pleasantries of hi, how are you, how's things since we last spoke, any further thoughts, build up the rapport again, and you'll say, well, look, we've had a look at the financials. We've come up with some sort of ballpark ideas. So, caveat: this is not a formal proposal. It's not an offer. It's just, look, if we're going to move into that offer process, which is really what the next stage would be, this is sort of where we think we're going to be. So what I can share with you is sort of a rough idea as to what the overall deal looks like, how it's structured in terms of, the initial payment, the seller financing piece, the time period to pay this over, how we're funding this deal, what it's going to cost to service this transaction. And then if you feel positive at the end of this conversation, what we'll then do is go off and work on a more formal proposal. So we'll go and do much more detailed modeling, and we'll come up with a formal proposal. So let me run you through the high level, what we think the deal looks like. If you're positive, we'll move it forward. If not, no hard feelings. We shake hands and we move on. And at this point, you would essentially share the data from that spreadsheet that we've just gone through. So, overall, we think the deal here looks like, maybe a purchase price of somewhere in the region of about 6 million. We think we can pay you at closing around about 4 million. That would leave a 2 million deferment, which we feel we can comfortably pay over 4 years. And we're going to fund this principally through debt. The servicing of that debt is around about 1.2 million. Against that EBITDA of 1.5 million, so more than enough cash flow coverage. That's sort of where we are. What are your thoughts to that? And of course, any business owner is always going to say no. Nobody says yes on the first offer, and if they did, I'd probably question the reason why, if they're that desperate to sell. So they're probably going to say, well, I was hoping for a little bit more, or really I want a bit more upfront, or I want the payment period to be less. And really, you can just sort of get into the detail there around, well, look, here's my spreadsheet. You can even pull it up on the screen and say, look, we're comfortable at this level of debt servicing. If we're going to increase the upfront, then that increases the debt. So whilst we might be able to tweak it a little bit, it's not going to be material. Again, in terms of the deferred, we've got 1.5 million of EBITDA, which suggests, for us to pay you 500k of deferred every year is more than affordable. The only way we can shorten that period would be if the business made more profit. So, one of the things potentially we could do in negotiations, Mr. Seller, would be to offer you an accelerator. And we say, look, the deal's based on 1.5 million of EBITDA. But if we uplift that through all of the improvements that we believe that we can make to grow the business, and let's say we end up with 2 million next year, then that would be a 500k uplift, and we could maybe pay a percentage of that uplift to accelerate the payment of that deferred in a quicker timescale. How would that sound? Or if they want more as an overall valuation, you could sort of link them back to the earnout and say, well, we base this on the here and now and the business today. We're not buying it in 3 years' time. We're buying it on the numbers today. But one thing you did tell me in our discussions is you're about to win this new contract. You've got this really strong pipeline. You're going to be involved for a 12-month period. So would you be open to exploring to get you that additional value? Is that we share some of the upside of those things. So if you stay with us for 12 months, you win the new business, you get the new contract deployed, and you help us grow the business, and that delivers an uplift in profit. We're happy to share a percentage of that uplift, which could potentially get you closer to the valuation that you're looking for. How would you feel about that? And most of the time they'll be positive. Or you could talk to them about, the proposal today is us buying 100% of the company. Would you be open to, retaining a minority share? I've already told you we're going on a buy and build strategy. The idea is to build a larger group that we sell for a higher value than we're buying today. And ultimately, if you have a percentage of that, then potentially that percentage could be worth more in 3-5 years' time when we get to our exit. Would you be open to exploring that? And again, you're not saying, we'll do this, we can do this. We're just saying, would you be open to this? How would you feel about that? You're getting their sort of feedback, so you can see what may be workable or not workable in negotiations. So Um, we're going to have a 10-minute break now, so it's 1:45 now. So I think if we all come back for 5 to, gives us enough to grab a coffee. And then what we'll do after the break is we'll look at the offer proposal in more detail. So we'll assume that the ballpark proposal's gone well. They're interested. Maybe there's a bit of negotiation to do, but we're going to launch. We're going to go offline. We're going to do more detailed financial modelling. We're going to come back with a proper professional offer proposal, and after the break, we'll get into the detail of what that looks like, and I'll give you a live example of that. So yeah, let's reconvene in 10 minutes. Okay, guys. So it's 5 to. Welcome back. We'll dive back into the slides. So I mentioned before the break that we've got the seller aligned. We've made the ballpark financials. Maybe there's a little bit of negotiation, but everything in the all in the realms of possibility. What we want to do now is basically go back and make a formal proposal to them. So in between us making that ballpark and making the sort of formal proposal, we will have done some more detailed financial modelling. I'm not going to show you that here. I will show you that when we get into the sort of due diligence side of things, because we've got an example financial model to share with you. So this is a professional deck. So you put here proposal to acquire, name of their company, maybe include their logo, and you would get them on a Zoom call, and you'd slide share this, or if you're going to do this in person, then you'd have this up on a screen. So done properly, this probably takes about 25 to 30 minutes. They're probably not going to say yay or nay at the end of it. Maybe there'll be a little bit of discussion around the areas that work and don't work. The idea is to work collaboratively and sort of close them for the next stage, which is really for them to come back with a formal response and enter into formal discussions and negotiations and to try and agree something. But this is really the headline information. So I would start by saying, so yeah, what we're going to do here is share with you, an offer proposal. So agenda for today is we're going to talk you through what that proposal looks like. We're going to talk about our experience. We're going to talk about the process, both pre-acquisition and post-acquisition, what that looks like, and the sort of typical timescales associated with that. We're going to look at the actual legal and financial deal structure, talk through our sort of focus, again, both pre and post acquisition. We'll get into the financial components of the proposal, and then we'll talk about the real estate separately. If there's no real estate element to the transaction, then obviously that wouldn't apply. But what we find in a lot of transactions where real estate is part of the deal is it warrants its own piece in terms of the presentation, because if you're carving it out, if the seller's keeping it, if we're doing a sale and lease back, if we're leveraging it, that can have fundamental differences as to how the transaction may be handled, both in terms of timescale and financing. So if we need to talk about the real estate separately, we will. Obviously, if it's not applicable, there's no real estate, then obviously that isn't applicable. We then talk about our experience. So this is obviously relevant to me. This deck is slightly out of date because we've done 108 transactions now, but yeah, we've done 108 transactions over the past 15 years, covering 32 different industries in 12 different countries. If I have specific sector experience, then I would also talk about specific companies that I've previously owned, and then we can talk more specifically about what they look like, and then we'll talk about key members of the team. So me and any of my colleagues, we put their profiles here and we talk about their expertise and things that they've done before. If you're doing this for the first time and you haven't got any track record or experience of doing deals, then my recommendation would be to partner with people that have, and you can populate this slide with, your advisory board members. Or if you're doing this alone and you have got a track record of doing stuff in your particular industry, then you would really go to town on what you've done before, even if it's not necessarily as a deal maker, but maybe you've worked for a company and you've transformed a business or whatever, or you're a qualified accountant accountant, or whatever your credentials are, then these slides really are to give the seller confidence that you are a person of experience, you have an experienced team behind you, and that their business, their legacy is going to be in safe hands. And then get into the process. So let me just walk you through the sort of process of where we are today and ultimately getting to a completion and what that looks like. So, if we can reach an agreement today or post this meeting, the next step will be for us to put together a term sheet which sort of captures the key components of the deal, which we hand over to the lawyers, and they'll then draw up the more detailed contracts off the back of it. We need to run a process of due diligence. So, that's legal, commercial, and financial. That typically takes 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how proactive and responsive and quick you are at populating a data room, getting back to us with queries. We use that financial due diligence to build our own more detailed financial modelling. Whilst all that's happening, we work through the legal process. So lawyers draw up the contracts and the necessary paperwork to get the transaction to work. We also raise funding alongside all of this. And then we move to a completion. Typically, that takes 3 to 4 months if everybody's proactive and efficient and responsive. If they're not, then it will drag things on. And if there is a real estate element, then potentially that could add another month or two to the timescale. But really, time kills deals. So let's all work proactively. If we're all on the same page, we've all got a deal. If we're all happy with the deal, then let's make it happen. Sorry, I've skipped ahead. One of the things that we need to do pre-completion is build a communications plan. So that starts with the staff. So what's the message to staff and key stakeholders? Really, it's business as usual. There's no fundamental change. Yes, there's a change of ownership, but we're still running the business in the same way. It's still the same name. It's still the same people behind it. Even if the owner is selling, they're still going to be involved in a handover. So still very much part of the business. So we build a communications plan. Initially on day one, that's probably with the staff. And then over time, we, get introduced to customers, suppliers, any key stakeholders, landlords, etc. over the first few weeks. First 30 days is really one about reassurance, carrying on just as the business was the day before the deal was done. And then we work over a sort of 6 to 12 month handover period where, we're learning the business, we're protecting the goodwill and relationships, we're succession planning, and we can also share with you other people that have been through this process. The legal structure of the deal is we're going to set up a new SPV, so limited liability company incorporated in the same country in which their company is. That will buy the shares of the business. Our focus is going to be very much about, protecting the business, your legacy, the people, the brand, the reputation. And it's really about us providing more opportunity through building an enlarged group of companies. If you have testimonials, case studies, track records, this will be sort of included here. If you don't, then you might want to build an advisory board or joint venture with people that can sort of put information here. But if we were doing this deal or we were partnering with somebody to do this deal, then there's basically some video testimonials, people that we've interviewed, people that we've bought companies from, staff that we've worked with, key people that we've worked with within an organization, and really their messages are obviously positive, and that just helps back up the messaging. I tend to mention more about my background, what I've done, that I've written a book about all of this stuff, which again enhances the credibility. We then get into the deal structure. So, we talk through, how the deal is going to be structured in terms of, an initial payment. If there's surplus cash to be dealt with, then obviously we'll talk about that. The seller financing, any tax implications, etc., etc. We then talk them through the metrics that we've used to come up with the deal. So if we're basing it on EBITDA or EBIT, what that figure is it an average? Is it a most recent? Have we included any add backs? If so, what are they? And exactly the same on the balance sheet. So what are the net assets? Are there any normalizations or adjustments that we made to that balance sheet? So they can see the logic behind the actual transaction itself. We then come up with a financial proposal. So overall, we're buying the company for X, and then we'll sort of break that down in terms of how much on closing, how much payable over what period and in what installments, and if there's an earnout, how is that calculated? And then if there's a real estate section where we're going to carve it out, do a sale and lease back or something else, then we specifically talk about it. But obviously, if it's not applicable, then that slide wouldn't be applicable. And then we ask them for, their initial thoughts, any questions, and then we agree the next steps. And the next steps typically tend to be, most of the time they'll probably give you an indication as to what works, what doesn't, what needs tweaking. If we followed the process so far and we've managed our expectations, in those first meetings, second meetings, we've presented the financial ballpark prior to this presentation meeting, then there shouldn't be any surprises for them. So if there are any tweaks to make, they shouldn't be material, and they should all be workable and manageable when we get to this point. So the idea is you're making this proposal with a view that they're going to accept it with some maybe minor tweaks, rather than them saying, no, this deal doesn't work for me at all, because if that was the case, then they probably would have figured that out many meetings before we get to this stage. So really what you're asking them for as the next steps is to come back with a formal response. Let's work collaboratively to figure out the things that may need tweaking, if anything, with a view of them moving towards a term sheet. And you don't want to leave them for too long. You want to keep that momentum going. So let's assume that we get a positive response. We do a bit of negotiation. They're sort of in principle up for the deal. What's the next step? So the next step is the term sheet. So I call the term sheet the roadmap for getting the deal done. So mainly it's a non-binding term sheet, in that it's really just a document for all parties to sort of capture what's been agreed in terms of what the deal looks like, what are the key terms and conditions, what's it conditional on, and I say that this is the roadmap that we hand over to the lawyers to basically build the formal contracts to solidify what the actual transaction looks like. There are some binding sections, which I'll show you a live example in a moment of a term sheet, and I'll explain what the binding sections are. But in the main, it's a non-binding agreement. So let's open up a term sheet and show you what this looks like. So again, this would be something that you could pull up on a share screen if you're on Zoom. If you're there in person, then you can have your laptop with your screen open and you can do this and almost fill it in together, or you take it along prepared, but with a view of amending anything and tweaking things as you see fit. So this is an indicative term sheet. I'll explain to the business owner that it's the roadmap for doing the deals. It's something that we hand over to the buyer, to the lawyers to draw up the contract. The only binding sections are confidentiality, to say that ultimately we're going to be bound by sharing information between one another, and we're going to keep it confidential to ourselves and our advisors. Exclusivity is a binding section. We don't want them selling the business somewhere else during any period of exclusivity, and we'll explain what that all means in a moment. We're all going to incur professional fees, so it's important that we're aware of that, and if we're basically both on the hook for those professional fees, and that this agreement, the binding parts, are governed by the laws of the country in which we're doing the deal. So all of the yellow highlighting here is the bits that we would normally change. The rest is pretty standard stuff. So we've got the name of the company that we want to buy. We've got the sellers, who will all be outlined here in terms of their shareholding. The purchaser is going to be an SPV. In this case, we're acting as a consultant to the buyer because we're doing the deal. But obviously, if you were doing the deal on your own and you weren't using a consultant, then you just take that out. Consideration, you're saying here that the consideration for the sale shares in the company is what the total purchase price is. There's an earn out on top, then that would go there. You're then explaining how this is structured. So we're going to pay this amount as an initial consideration, this amount as a deferred amount, and then if there is an earn out, how that is calculated. Obviously, if there wasn't an earn out, you would remove that. Funding, you're going to deal with surplus cash. So if you're including surplus cash in the sale because of tax benefits of doing so, like I mentioned before, in the UK, if they benefit from business asset disposal relief, it makes sense for them to take the cash as part of the transaction and pay capital gains tax and not pay it as a dividend. Obviously, if that wasn't applicable, then you would just remove the bit about the surplus cash. But essentially what it's saying is that we're using debt to fund the transaction. If you're offering any form of guarantees, and we'll talk specifically about security and guarantees as we get into the legal process, so not one for now, but if you were offering any, then this would be included here. If the seller's involved in a handover, which most of the time they will be, then you'll put here that you expect them to be signing up to an employment or service agreement, on terms to be agreed post signing this term sheet. Terms and conditions of the sale and purchase agreement. So, once we've signed this, we'll hand it over to the lawyers. They'll draw up the share sale and purchase agreement. That will contain customary warranties and representations and indemnities. And it's conditioned to completion that we complete satisfactory legal and financial due diligence, that there's no material difference in the net asset or profitability position of the company between us signing this and the actual SPA. So what this is saying is, suddenly if the business falls off a cliff, then clearly that condition isn't met, so you wouldn't proceed. Really what you're trying to say here is that they're going to maintain performance. It's conditional on the seller being involved in a handover and executing a service agreement or an employment agreement. Receipt of final approval for the board of directors of the purchaser, which is pretty much a given, subject to all of these other conditions being met. The board will sign off on this if they get satisfactory due diligence, they're comfortable that the financial position of the company is the same as when we executed this, and the sellers confirm that they're going to be involved in a handover. And then receipt of any corporate or third party approvals, if any. So sometimes in some contracts within the business, there could be change of control clauses. So this is common in leases, in any funding, external funding arrangements, where the bank will essentially say it's an event of default if there's a change of control, or you may need landlord consent for the lease to whilst the lease is between the company and the landlord, there might be a change of control clause in there. So normally we'd pick that out in due diligence and figure out what third party approvals, if any, are required. But clearly that would be conditional on completion, because if the landlord says no, or any financial institution says no, then potentially that puts a kibosh on the deal. Due diligence post signing this term sheet, we're going to issue you with a checklist. I'll show you a checklist when we get to the due diligence stage, and an example of what a completed one looks like. But essentially, this gives them a shopping list of information that they're going to need to provide to us for us to review. Confidentiality is a binding agreement, binding part of the agreement that basically says we're all going to share information between ourselves and our professional advisors, but we agree to keep it confidential between us and those professional advisors. Exclusivity. So when we sign this term sheet, there's a lot of time, effort, and work and cost that goes into putting these transactions together. And one of the things we want to avoid is for the seller to turn around in 1 or 2 months' time and say, "Hey, I've decided to sell the company to somebody else, and we've incurred a load of time, effort, and cost for no output." So what we ask them to do is to commit to an exclusivity period. Typically that's between 4 and 6 months, and during that period they agree basically not to enter into negotiations, discussions with any other interested party or sell the company elsewhere, and that just means that we've got a fair crack of the whip to do the due diligence, raise the funding, get through the legal process, without the risk of ultimately them selling the company somewhere else. Fees, we're both going to be on the hook for our own professional fees. So, whatever we incur, we'll pay. Whatever they incur, they'll pay. But we're not going to be liable to them for their fees, and vice versa, in the event, for whatever reason, the transaction doesn't complete. And then this agreement is governed by the laws of whichever country you're doing the transaction is, and then all parties would sign. And then we have an appendix here, which usually just sort of outlines the proposed timescale. So, we agree to sign off on this term sheet before the end of the month. Due diligence checklist is issued immediately. First round of due diligence is sort of dealt with within the first month. Due diligence is completed within 2 months of the term sheet. Draft sale and purchase contract is probably issued in month 2. The legals are finally agreed in month 3, and then we move towards a completion within 3 to 4 months. We obviously have flexibility in terms of putting in those milestones. It's not binding on the parties, but it helps to keep everybody in check and on track to say, well, look, by this date we're supposed to have done this. By this date we're supposed to have done that, and it just helps gee everybody along. So let's go back into the slides. So due diligence then. So we've presented the term sheet. They've signed off on the term sheet after our tweaks and negotiations. What we would do immediately upon signature of the term sheet is to issue them with a due diligence checklist, and I'm going to show you an example of one of those in a moment. But essentially, due diligence is 3 things: commercial, legal, and financial. And really, what we're looking at is any legal agreements within the business, the constitution of the company, what's behind the financials, both the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flows, the forecasts. We're really sense checking checking all of those things, the assets and liabilities of the company. And commercial is possibly partly done already by the time we get to this point, because we've understood the market we're doing a roll up in, the competition, the landscape, the compliance, regulatory, set up within the industry, and we're just seeing how they fit into all of that, their operating procedures, their customers, who do they do business with, our customer concentrations, how long have they done business with, how does invoicing work, all of those sort of key things. What we're looking to do, and a lot of people that buy companies tend to use this due diligence process as a way to basically hammer them down in price. So we agree a headline deal. We then go and do a load of due diligence, find a load of issues, and we use those issues to justify why we might not be prepared to pay the same price, and we want to renegotiate. From my perspective, we want to use a due diligence process to do two things. One is to understand the business, so that when we actually do the transaction, we're going in with our eyes open. We really understand the business as much as we can. And the second thing is to identify any key risks and then figure out, do we want to still proceed with the transaction based on that knowledge? If we do, we then want to understand how we can protect ourselves against those key risks. And the key risks fundamentally, there's many, but the main ones are litigation, risks from people suing the company, whether that be ongoing litigation, whether that be contingent litigation, potential future claims where insurance doesn't cover that, financial performance and the actual financials themselves. So, what's in the accounts? Is there anything hidden? Is there anything we need to know about? Understanding the business operating model and the risks associated with that. And of course, also the people. There's going to be key people within this business that this business will struggle to function without, and we need to identify those and plan for, if those people weren't involved, how we might deal with that contingency. So the next stage is fundraising, which we'll come on to. Let me now just give you an example of the due diligence. Okay, so the first one to show you is a blank version. So you just zoom in because this is very small. So I think this is probably a UK one. Let me just check. Yeah, UK one. But whether it's US or Australia or wherever, it's the same sort of information that we're getting, but maybe the terminology might be slightly different. So we're asking for financial information, so full accounts for 3 years, management accounts, age debtors report, age creditors report, top 10 customers, fixed asset register, copy of any external funding, bank overdrafts, asset finance, invoice finance agreements and terms and conditions. If they have a forecast, we ask for that. Example paper trail for client invoicing, so purchase orders, terms and conditions, customer contracts, business bank accounts, so for all accounts, full statements for the past 12 months, and most recent trial balance that we can then tie back to our own financial modelling, but also their financial statements that they've produced. Legal and company constitution, copy of share certificates, memorandum and articles of association, corporation certificate, if there's any shareholders agreement, if any, copies of all past resolutions from the past 5 years and board minutes for the last 3. Legal documentation, so this is material agreements between suppliers and customers, standard T's and C's for customers, framework agreements, consulting agreements, partnership agreements. General, so sort of marketing materials, insurance, copy of insurance policies and certificates, and licenses and certifications. Property, any leases, title of property owned. Website, so confirmation of ownership of website domain. HR, employment contracts for all existing staff, self-employed contracts or contractors, details of any employees that are no longer employed in the business in the last 3 years. Software, and details of any software and supporting software agreements. Tax, corporation tax returns, sales tax returns, VAT, payroll tax reports, screenshots of tax portals showing that all tax payments are up to date, so corporation tax, sales tax, payroll taxes, and general, could be, since COVID, how's business changed, their SWOT analysis on the business. And in some markets we're operating in, we are seeing quite significant rises in energy costs. So we've actually included that now as a DD item, just for us to be able to forecast future energy costs. So fairly light touch due diligence, but that gives us enough to start with. What we would normally do is set up a cloud-based data room. So this could be something as simple as a Google Drive, a Dropbox folder, where they basically upload all of this information. We ask them to index it. So we'll populate the data room with blank folders. So, there'll be a folder for financial, there'll be 1.1 for full accounts, 1.2 for management accounts, 1.3 for aged debtors. And that just means that they can organize all the data in line with all of these indexes. And it just makes for us reviewing and collating and understanding and interpreting information, rather than them just bundling everything into one data room. So financials, this enables us to do the financial due diligence. We're looking at historic performance, we're looking at margins, we're looking at sort of payment profiles for creditors and debtors, we're looking at customer concentration. Is there any risks there? Is more business done with one customer than others? What happens if that customer were to leave? The assets recorded in the accounts, are they the same as what's on the asset register? Are all of the assets present and correct? Paper trail for client invoicing is really for us to understand how invoicing works, and business bank accounts is to see how funds flow through the company over a 12-month period, so we can pick up any seasonality and track back with the trial balance, specific transactions, and check that, accounting is all done properly. If they're audited, then that maybe gives us a little bit more protection, because an auditor's also signing off on to say that, the financial statements, as far as they're concerned, are, represent a true version of this business. But if they're under the audit threshold, then you're essentially reliant on either their external accountant, who won't have the same level of audit transparency, or just the directors themselves can file the financial statements and sign off on them. So, probably where they're audited, we're going to be far more rigorous in our financial review, and be less reliant on warranties, because we're really going to want to make sure that the directors' accounts are, all present and correct. There's no issues with them. Whereas if we've got audited accounts, then we might take more of a view that, well, an auditor signed off on them. Yes, we'll still do a level of financial due diligence, but we're also going to be more reliant upon the warranties. Legal and company constitution really is just to see, how the company is set up, how it's organised, and how and if it's being compliant in terms of sort of following company law. Legal documentation regarding company trading, really it's to see, customer terms, conditions, any other key material agreements, whether there's anything in there like change of control or any other issues. Insurance, general, property, website, all fairly self-explanatory. HR is really to sort of get a fundamental, an idea of, the people, the organizational chart, who's involved, staff turnover, whether there's any gaps in skills and experience, bonus arrangements, erroneous terms and conditions like very long notice periods for staff. Tax is really to make sure that, what they're declaring mirrors what their accounting says, and that they're up to date with all of their tax obligations. So yeah, fairly self-explanatory. So let's have a look at an example of a completed due diligence. Okay, I'm just going to zoom out first just to quickly show you how this is structured. So you have various tabs. This is the main DD checklist, which is what you've just seen. We've then got an operational due diligence checklist, which I'll explain, which is specific to the actual company itself. And we then have just some specific data tabs that we ask for. So this is the due diligence checklist that you've just seen. You'll see here that there's various columns. So queries round one, this would be where we would raise queries relating to that item. So in regards to the full accounts for the last 3 years, we've raised in this example 5 specific questions about those. There is then a response box. So we would send the queries, they would then type in their responses to those questions. Based on their answers, we may then raise further queries. So you can see in this example, this has raised 3 further questions. They've then come back with their responses to those questions. And then you can see here, as we get to round 3, as far as we're concerned, we have no further questions or queries in relation to the full 3 years accounts, and we're satisfied with their answers. And we sort of run through this process. Usually you go back into probably twice, maybe 3 times. So when they've populated the data room, we'll review it. We won't review it until they've populated everything, because otherwise it tends to be a bit piecemeal. So what you tend to find is that, it takes them maybe 2 to 4 weeks to populate everything that we need to see. We'll then review that within a week, and we'll list all the questions. They'll then come back within 1 to 2 weeks with their answers. Sometimes those answers might prompt further queries or requests for information. But usually once you've done that twice, maybe maximum 3 times, you can pretty much tick off those issues. We then color code it. So generally, if it's yellow, it's still outstanding some information. If it's green, it means we've completely satisfied ourselves. If it's red, then it means that there's an issue that we've identified that we need to build some specific warranty or indemnity into the contract. Operational due diligence follows the same approach. So, we're looking at sort of standard operating procedures, sales and marketing strategies, client retention, software, etc., 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 etc. And there'll be specific questions. Some of these might be generic, some might be more specific to their industry or specific to their business. So this tends to be a little bit more tailored. And then again, they have their opportunity to provide a response. There's then some sort of standard information where they'd record who their auditor, who their tax advisor, who the company secretary, who the legal person is, who the bank accounts are with, key information, key personnel, bank signatories, accountants, key holders, all of that sort of stuff. That tab isn't relevant. So that's an example of a sort of completed checklist. So very much driven by how quick they are to provide the information. If they're slow, it takes longer. Obviously, if they're proactive, then great. And I'll talk you through how we manage this process a little bit later on in the session today, whereby we can do certain things that can influence people to take action and work through the process very quickly. So where we are now is, we've agreed the deal in the term sheet. We've undertaken our due diligence. Probably after the first round of due diligence, we've got enough to kickstart the legal and fundraising process. We don't do that as soon as the term sheet is signed. Yes, we will have gone and engaged with lenders, and I'll talk you through that process in a moment, prior to this point. But we won't have actually formally made an application to a lender, because a lot of what lender will ask for from a due diligence point of view is going to be contained in the data room. And partly, we need that information so that we can look like we're very efficient, and we've got all of the information, and this is a well-run business, and we've collated all of the information that a lender wants to see, rather than being piecemeal and send them emails here and there with different bits and pieces. We want everything organized and ready to go when we're ready to apply. And secondly, we're getting our head around any fundamental risks in the business, so that as and when and if it comes up with a lender, we can talk about that and address it head on. And thirdly, we want to really understand the business and the operating model, and if we do detailed due diligence, then it enables us to be able to go into that lender meeting when we've applied, and answer their questions knowledgeably, rather than just throwing a load of information at them and hoping for the best. And then when they come back with all of their queries and questions and ask about certain things, and we look like a bit of a rabbit in headlights, we don't want that scenario. We want to look like we really understand this business. So that's why we don't start raising the funding formally until we've done that first round of due diligence. So to raise the funding, we need to essentially provide a shopping list of information to the lender. So again, we'll sort of give them access to the data room, or we'll do a specific data room for them with specific levels of information. There'll be a business plan that will be in there, and there'll also be a detailed financial model. So let me show you some examples. Okay, so here we go. So ultimately, when we apply to the lender and we've submitted all of this information, ultimately where we want to get to is getting a credit approved offer. So typically the process tends to be we submit the data room, we submit the business plan, we submit the financial forecast. Depending on the type of funding that we're raising, if it's invoice finance, it's likely that the funder will want to go and do their own audit, which typically takes half a day to a day. Most of that can be done remotely, but most of the time they will want to visit the business really just to meet the key management and to see the business in operation and look at the sort of financial processes. If we're borrowing money against real estate, then there might be a requirement for a valuation report. If we're borrowing money against plant and machinery, then again, there might be a requirement for them to go and inspect the equipment within the business and get a formal valuation on it. Once those things are done, and we've gone through the various meetings and sort of walked through the business plan and got the funder on side, then we move towards getting a credit approved offer. So this is an example of a credit approved offer, and generally it will set out. So in this case, we're taking on invoice finance, so we can see what the funding limit is, what the key terms and conditions are, so arrangement fee, renewal fee, percentage that they'll pay against those debts. So in this case, we're factoring 85% of the invoice value. So for every £1 million worth of invoices, they'll fund us 850k. What the recourse period is, any other key criteria, fees and charges. So what the service fee is, what the discount rate is. There's also a cash flow lending on this one of 250k over 36 months at a 7% interest rate. We're then securing plant and machinery finance at 250k, and then it's costing us 10.5% over a 5-month period. And then if there's any other sort of key terms and conditions, they'll all be outlined in the back. So that's an example of a credit-backed offer. Typically that takes if due diligence takes 4 to 6 weeks, the funding process, depending on the complexities, takes 4 to 6 weeks. And the idea is that whilst you're doing all of that, you're running the legal process at the same time, so that you get to a point of everything coming together at the same time, ready for a completion. So let's dive back into the slides. So just a word about funders. So my recommendation would be, is, as I said at the start, it's very much about the successful people, as I see it, are the people that focus on a particular industry. So it's not about just looking for deals anywhere in any sector. You pick a sector based on your experience, where you've worked, where you've owned a business, where you've got contacts, where you've got a passion for. You go and research that industry. I would probably start with, is it big enough to do a roll-up? If it is, will the LBO model work? Can you borrow money against assets? And contrary to belief, B2B service industries work just as well as more industrial, plant-heavy businesses. An engineering business that owns its factory, that owns its plant and machinery. Yes, you could raise funding against all of those, but a recruitment staffing business that doesn't own its premises, that's purely a service business, that its only real asset is its receivables, is equally as fundable as that engineering business, if anything, arguably easier. So does the LBO, is it big enough? Does the LBO model work? And then if I end up building this group, can I sell it? So who's going to buy me? Who's acquiring in this space? And if you can tick the boxes to those fundamentally 3 things, then I would start planning for, right, how am I going to do this? So I'll do my outreach, I'll build my data, I'll do the letters, I'll do the emails, I'll engage with business owners. Whilst I'm doing that, I also go and have initial conversations with funders. So essentially what I'll do is I'll approach them way before we get a deal, and I'll phone them up, or I'll do some research. Who's funding in this space? I'll look in trade press. I'll look at other transactions that have happened. I'll look for lenders that I might be aware are in this space, and I'll pick up the phone to those people. I can identify the right person. So you're probably looking for business development managers, relationship managers, credit underwriters, decision makers, and I'm phoning them up and I'm saying, I'm Paul Seabridge, I'm looking to do a buy and build strategy in this particular space. So let's say it's healthcare, in the healthcare space. My goal will be to put 5 or 6 companies together, drive the synergies between those companies, such as consolidating head office functions, cross-selling opportunities, buying power. And really what I wanted to do was just have a chat to you today briefly to understand, A, are you in lending mode? And if you are, what sort of typical criteria you would look at for this sort of thing. And then you ask a load of intelligent questions off the back of it. Are they in lending mode? Yes. What's their core criteria? Can they tell me about other deals that they've done recently that successfully went through? Why did they successfully go through? Key criteria from the lender in terms of red flags, what they look for, how they like the deals to be packaged up, and you make it abundantly clear that look, at the moment I don't have a deal. My role in all of this is a facilitator, so I'm looking to create a relationship with a bank that can help me fund these transactions, and I'll bring the right people and the right deals together and connect those with the capital from a bank that we can create this relationship with. You've built the relationship, you've gone on a bit of a fishing exercise, you've got a bit of a handle as to what they would lend, what their criteria is, so that when you actually get that deal and you agree that deal, you're agreeing that deal in line with sort of what their criteria was. So you can give that same person a call once you're ready to approach the fundraising and say, hey, we spoke 2, 3, 5 months ago. I've now got a deal, and I want to basically present that to you with a view of seeing if we can arrange funding for it. And then you would follow the process with the lender and present that deal in the best way that sort of fits with their process and criteria. So let's have a look at the legal process now. So we've started the due diligence process. We've started to uncover some key risks that maybe we're comfortable with, but we need to protect ourselves in the legal process. We've kicked off the fundraising process. Now we want to involve the lawyers to build the legal documents. So fundamentally, the main document that we need to be concerned with initially is the sale and purchase contract. That's the main document. It can stretch to hundreds of pages. And then there's some ancillary documents that accompany that. So that could be share transfer forms, board minutes, et cetera, et cetera. I'll show you some examples of that. Let me show you an SPA. Bear with me. Okay, so this is an example of a share purchase agreement. This is for a UK deal, but they all pretty much look the same. It's just that they'll contain the same sort of sections. It's just that the actual law it will be based on obviously will be subject to your country that you're doing the deal in. So who the company is, us as the buyer, how the thing's structured. You've then got all of the definitions. I'll just scroll up to the top so you can see the sections rather than go through them all specifically. But yeah, you've got warranties, how warranty claims will be dealt with, post completion covenants on the seller, so like non-competes, confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. There'll be various schedules depending on what's included in the sale and what needs to be documented. So yeah, you can see here this is 107 pages long, so fairly detailed document. There'll then be some ancillary documents. So, for example, this could be board minutes. So, example of some board minutes for you. Yeah, just standard sort of board minutes outlining the transaction that is being agreed. What the purchase price is, all parties sign. Fairly straightforward. And then this one's probably quite a good one to show you. So this is a documents list. So this is like an index of all of the documents that need to be executed as part of the transaction. So share purchase agreement, disclosure letter. I'll explain what a disclosure letter is when we go back into the slides. Stock transfer form, share certificates. Most of the time sellers don't seem to have share certificates, so you might need an indemnity, any powers of attorney to exercise documents, letters of resignation, letters of appointment for the board minutes for buyer, seller, company, Person of significant control or relevant legal entity, letters, various companies, house forms. This is a UK deal, so there'll be the filings. If you're in Australia, it'll be ASIC forms. In the US, it'll just be depending on which state you're incorporated in. There'll be various forms that need to be filed. Consultancy agreement with the seller, debenture securities. Again, I'll talk about securities as we go through this when we go back into the slides. And then if there's any conditions or documents that need to be delivered at completion that are obligations on either party, what they are and who's responsible for that. So, that bundle of documents probably stretches to hundreds and hundreds of pages. And it's good that the lawyer sort of has an index of, what's needed, who's responsible for it, has it been done, who's it got to be signed by. So it makes completion a little bit easier. So let's just go back into slides. So the legals, I mean, whilst they stretch into hundreds of pages, I think the key contentious areas for me tend to be really around the warranties. There's a few other sections which I'll speak about in a moment, but let's just talk about warranties and indemnities. So what are warranties? So warranties are effectively an assurance of a state of affairs, and the seller has the opportunity to disclose matters relating to those warranties. So as a very simple example, one of the warranties may be that the seller is not aware of any pending insurance claims. But let's say that they are, because maybe a staff member has had a personal injury at work. We think that's going to be covered by insurance if there is a claim. But the seller is obviously aware of a matter that it can't just give a warranty to say it's not aware of any pending insurance claims, because it is. So in its disclosure letter, it would say, in relation to warranty number XYZ, in regards to we're not aware of any pending insurance claims, actually we are. And then they would outline the background to, there's been a member of staff, they incurred a personal injury because they fell over on site, they did this is what happened, this is where it's at with the insurance company, and they provide a more detailed narrative. Now, if the seller discloses that matter, we can't sue them later on once the transaction has happened under the warranties, because as far as we're aware, we've gone in with our eyes wide open. We asked for a warranty to say they're not aware of any issues. They clearly are, but they've disclosed it, so they're not hiding anything. We're aware, and we have to proceed on the basis that we are aware of that disclosure. So should anything untoward happen in regards to that, then there's no recourse from us because they've told us. If they didn't tell us, and that subsequently then cost us, then of course we could sue them under the warranties. Indemnities, these are different because these are effectively a promise to reimburse an indemnity holder. So in this instance, us as the buyer, in respect of a future liability. So let's say in due diligence, we look at their aged receivables report. We can see that there's a customer that hasn't paid their bill. It's overdue by 4 months. And when we do a little bit more digging, they say, well, they've disputed it. They may be in financial difficulty. We're not sure actually if we're going to be able to collect on this. So they could still, make a disclosure. So, the warranties of, we're not aware of any impending bad debts. They could disclose saying, well, customer ABC, is currently overdue by 4 months and we're not sure whether we'll be able to collect it. Again, they've disclosed it, but we might seek in that instance a specific indemnity, which basically says, look, if this customer ends up being a bad debt post-transaction, then you agree to indemnify us. Why would they do that? Well, because if we're basing the deal on the net assets, those net assets include receivables. And in those receivables, if let's say those receivables are £1 million, but 50 grand of them is to this customer that then ultimately goes bust or doesn't pay, and it turns into a bad debt that has to be written off, then essentially on closing, we were buying a business that was overinflated with its net asset position because there was a 50 grand bad debt that hadn't come to fruition, but potentially was likely. So we should have the right to essentially be reimbursed by the seller for that bad debt, which could either be them paying us back the value of that bad debt or agreeing to offset that bad debt against any future deferred consideration. So I think the way to move through this process is very much about communication. This is relevant to the entire process, not just the legal and sort of once you've signed the term sheet stage. So what we suggest really is sort of focusing on these five key areas. So first and foremost is communication. So once we sign that term sheet, I would set up a weekly stakeholder call. On it, there will be you as the buyer, the seller, both sets of lawyers, and any other professionals that might need to be to come into the process, accountants, whatever. Sometimes those weekly meetings might take 5 minutes, sometimes they might take an hour. But the idea is that in each weekly meeting which you chair, is that you agree some actions and then you review those actions in the following meeting. So, next week we go back to, you said you were going to do this. Have you done it? Yes, tick it off. Great, we've made progress. If you haven't, why not? When can we do it? So that you basically just manage people through the process. And it just means that if there are any contentious issues, rather than sort of getting lost in emails, which can always be misinterpreted, you can tackle them head on as you go through the process and sort of work more collaboratively with all key stakeholders so everybody can understand people's points of view and deal with any issues as they arise. I think from a contentious issues point of view, the term sheet is quite a helpful document here because it's the roadmap that you've handed over to the lawyers to draw up the contract. So you've agreed probably in the term sheet the most contentious areas, which is really around warranties, around maybe the caps for warranty claims, the process for warranty claims, the minimum amount of warranty claims, the right to set off against warranty claims. So all of those things are typically in the term sheet. So when they come to drafting the SPA, if they decide that they want to use different terms, you can basically just point everybody back to saying, well, hey, I'm not sure why we're trying to change the goalposts here because look, we've already agreed this in the term sheet. This term sheet signed by buyer and seller say that we've agreed that this is the agreement. So, in other words, stop changing what's already been agreed. Let's just focus on things that haven't been agreed. Warranties can be contentious in terms of sort of how the claim process is handled and quite common how they're qualified. Most seller side lawyers will want to qualify the warranty. So say something like, as far as the seller is aware, rather than just saying the warranty is this. That can be bit subjective and can be better for the seller, and it's trying to find some compromise in what should be qualified and what shouldn't be. I think general non-important warranties is fine, but fundamental ones like tax or legal, then they shouldn't be qualified. And at the end of the day, the seller has the disclosure process. So look, if they know something that think potentially could be an issue, disclose it. If you disclose it, you're covered. If you don't disclose it, then you risk being sued under the warranties. The other contentious areas around protection and security. So, you may agree as part of the deal that for as long as you owe them deferred consideration, that you agree not to do certain things with the business. So this could be things like not declare big dividends, not take major management fees, not restructure the business other than the ordinary course of business, not instigating any major capital expenditure or litigation that costs the company money other than in collection of bad debts, for example. So sometimes the seller will want, to basically tie your hands behind your back and not allow you to do anything for as long as that deferred is outstanding, and then you're free to do whatever you want, whereas you want to invest in this business, grow it, and if you've got your hands tied behind your back, it can be quite difficult. You have to respect that ultimately they're a creditor of the business for as long as that you owe them deferred consideration, so they're not going to want you to do anything that fundamentally wrecks the business, that puts their deferred consideration at risk. But equally, they need to respect that you're buying it, you're paying them some meaningful sum of money to take control of the company, and as such you should be within reason free to develop the business as you see fit. So you're willing to have certain protections in the contract, but they need to be reasonable and fair. In terms of security, so we always start when we're negotiating a transaction that we don't offer any security. We're offering you an amount up front, we're then offering you a deferred payment and maybe some sort of earn-out. But if you don't offer, it doesn't mean that they can't ask. So if they ask, these are the sorts of typical securities that you could potentially offer in an SPV structure. So you could offer them a debenture. So essentially this is a secured charge over the assets of the company in favour of them. When all of the deferred is paid, that debenture falls away. But for as long as that debenture is outstanding, ultimately, if you defaulted, they could potentially use that debenture to take back control of the company. Share charge enables them to do that probably a lot quicker without using an insolvency process to make that happen. So essentially, you just pledge the shares in the company, and if at any point you default, then they can essentially just take the shares back. What's important to remember with regards to security is that this would normally be it will always be subordinated to any senior debt holder. So whoever the bank is you're going to use to fund this transaction, asset-based lender, whoever, they're going to have first ranking security over the business. So that would be a debenture. So if the seller's going to have a debenture, they would have to sit subordinated. So essentially that means, the bank has first dibs on the security and then they have second dibs. So, bank basically controls the process. So it could be argued that, that's not really then worth the paper it's written on, which is why maybe you might offer the share charge to give them easy way to take back control of the company, or offer them protections in the SPA that says what you can and can't do for as long as they are essentially a creditor of the business. And yeah, I think we've covered those contentious areas. The other one is just probably really around the non-compete side of things, which is if you've approached a baby boomer that's looking to retire, then the risk of them deciding to go and set up a rival business is pretty limited. They're retiring for a reason. They probably don't want the stress and hassle of setting up another business. It's probably not their intention anyway. But it can be an area that can be contentious where lawyers will push for maybe a 12-month, 24-month non-compete. So when you take over the business, the seller agrees not to go and compete with you, take customers away, take key staff away. But after that non-compete expires, then essentially they're free to do all of those things. You need to take a view on it, really understanding the seller as to, if that was really contentious, trying to understand why. If anything, I would probably be probing, if it was a relatively short period, why that is the case. Ultimately, if they're looking to retire and have absolutely no intention of competing with you ever again, then signing a 5 or even a 10-year non-compete shouldn't be an issue for them. But yeah, typically we normally sort of try and do a 2 to 4 year time frame post the deferred falling away. So if you're going to take 3 years to pay them off, you'd probably then ask for another 2 years of non-compete. So you've basically got 5 years of owning, running, buying, building this business, maybe selling it before there's any risk of them potentially deciding to set up again. But in reality, it's probably a sort of almost like a red herring, because it's probably not their intention to do that. So let's take a short break. Now it's 10:02. So again, if we come back in 10 minutes' time, gives us a chance for a comfort break, put the kettle on, and then we're into the sort of final stages really of the seminar today, where we're going to talk about once that deal's done, what sort of the run up to completion looks like and how things are handled on completion day. We'll then talk through the growth post acquisition, and then we'll sort of summarize and we'll dive into any Q&A that we've got before we bring things to a close today. So let's have a 10-minute break. I'll see you all again back in 10 minutes time. Okay, welcome back. So before we get back into the slides, there's just a few questions that are open here on the Q&A. So I'll use this opportunity to go through those questions and do my best to answer them, and then we'll get back into the content. So question from Naz, how do you deal with personal guarantees in the buy, build, sell, leverage buyout models? Can this be avoided, and what's the potential risk? So obviously, it's up to the individual that's doing the acquisition as to whether or not they're prepared to sign personal guarantees. My view is that you shouldn't do a transaction with a personal guarantee, and really it's about following the process to ensure you get to a point where you ultimately get an offer from a bank where there is no PG, or if there is one, it can be negotiated out. So the reason I say you should approach the bank once you've decided on what roll-up you're going to do, before you even get to getting a deal, you go and talk to the bank and ask them for their criteria and positioning yourself One way is to understand, what's a sort of red flag for a lender. What's their core criteria, and if their core criteria is we absolutely won't lend to anybody unless they're prepared to sign a PG, then you sort of discount that lender and move on to the next one. What you tend to find from a bank's point of view is that they always start with they want personal guarantees, but if you follow the process and you go and approach 4 or 5 different lenders and you end up getting credit backed offers from 2 or 3 of them, then you can play one off against the other to ultimately negotiate with them to, hopefully get to a point where you can negotiate away those personal guarantees. You could go to one lender and say, well, look, I'd like to try and fund this transaction with you because you're offering more favourable terms. But one of the sticking points from my perspective is you're asking for a personal guarantee. I'm not prepared to sign a personal guarantee. You've known from the outset that we're using a special purpose vehicle, a limited liability company. The whole purpose of that is to have a limited liability, and if I sign a PG, then you're essentially piercing that corporate veil. So, we're not prepared to sign a personal guarantee, but if you're willing to, do these terms on the basis of no PG, then we're willing to progress. A few other things that you can do to sort of avoid them would be number two would be to build an advisory board, and we'll talk specifically in detail more about this. But if you recruited a chairman that was 30, 40 years in your industry specialism, you get a semi-retired or retired big four trained accountant, CFO type individual, maybe pay them in equity 5-10%, and you can take them along to your meetings with the financial institutions. Then the banks are going to feel far more confident. The reason they're asking for a PG is because they're not confident that, look, if all this fails, where do we go for our money? Well, let's go after him personally. But if you've got a chairman that's been there, done it, worn the t-shirt, got 30, 40 years experience, you've got an amazing 30-year experience, big four trained accountant, same on the legal side, other industry experts that you can bring to the party, then that essentially provides a lender with far more comfort. The other thing as well is that when you're going through the process with the lender and you've done the financial modelling and you're sharing that with them, I think being able to ask intelligent questions and demonstrate, that you've stress tested the model. So one of the things we've done, Mr. Lender, is, we've looked at what if we lose this customer, what if margins increase, what if, revenues decline, and the impact on the financial model. So we want to share out all of those scenarios and show you what leeway we've got that, if all of these bad things happen, how far it goes before we get into a position where we can't actually service this debt. I think as long as you're addressing the risk with the lender and you're showing that you've considered all of these things, then that's all powerful arguments for basically, getting to the point of not having to sign a PG. There are other things you can do depending on the specific type of funding to sort of negate the risk. So one of the things could be that, in invoice finance, for example, instead of signing a PG, what you could say is they could put a reserve on the facility. So let's say you have a £1 million receivable book and you want to borrow 85% of that, so 850k. They might put, instead of putting 100k guarantee, personal guarantee, they might put 100k reserve on the facility. So essentially you still get your 85%, but they put 100k reserve. So on £1 million, 85% is 850, less 100k reserve gives you an availability of 750. And you can say that, as you meet certain milestones, which might be time-based, might be hitting EBITDA forecast, whatever, and the bank becomes more, used to working with you and understanding how you're operating the business, etc., and the risk starts to become less and less, then that reserve can be reduced over time. If you do get to a point of personal guarantees and it is something that you're willing to do, then there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Number one is that the bank's going to want to see your personal assets and liabilities in the country in which you're doing the deal to make sure that you've actually got enough equity in your assets to cover any future PG. So, if you don't own any property, don't own it, you're not a homeowner, you own no assets in the country, and you're willing to sign a PG, the lender wouldn't accept one from you anyway because you don't have any means to pay it. The second thing would be to, if you do sign a PG, is to look at insurance. So, there are specialist companies out there in the US, in Australia, in the UK, and in fact, we've just completed a deal last Friday with a funder that was in quite high risk industry construction, which has a notorious reputation for high level of insolvency. So funding, particularly given that the debt was contractual, there was milestones and retentions and all of that sort of stuff. So things that basically all the things that invoice finance lenders don't like. So PG was basically a non-negotiable, regardless of the process that we followed. So one way to deal with this is to actually insure it. So we've insured the PG to the value of 80%. So the PG is for $1.5 million Australian dollars. So we can insure essentially 1.2 million of that, which leaves an exposure of 300k, which the buyer is comfortable with. So hopefully that answers your question. Next question, again from Naz. Typically, what are the different professional fees? Can you provide some indicative costs based on the deals that you've done? Yeah, sure. Generally, when you're doing a leverage buyout, what you want to do is when you're analysing the deal and putting the transaction together is you don't want to borrow just enough money to pay out the seller, whatever the seller closing payment is, but you also want to borrow enough money to cover any professional fees, so lawyers, accountants, tax experts, also the fees that the lenders or the financiers may put on the transaction. If you're going directly to a lender, then these will likely be less. But if you're going through an intermediary like a finance broker, then you might have broker fees and things like that to pay. Also, if you're working with introducers where you pay them a finder's fee for finding you successful deals, you might need to factor that in. So there's a whole host of professional fees. So what I would always recommend at the outset is to find a lawyer, an accountant that will work for you on a contingent fixed fee basis, which might seem quite alien to most professional advisors because most lawyers are used to working by the hour. They get paid whether the deal gets done. The longer they spend on the deal, the higher their bill. So we always recommend go with a contingent fixed fee. They get paid if the deal gets done. That incentivizes them to get the deal done quickly because the sooner they get the deal done, the sooner they get paid. You fix the fee, so it doesn't matter whether it takes them 10 hours or 100 hours to work on the transaction. You know exactly what you're paying, and from their perspective, some deals take longer than others, some are more complicated than others, and it swings in roundabouts. And if you're going to be a serial acquirer, the idea is that the reason they would do this with you is because you're going to hopefully build a long-term relationship and they're going to become your trusted advisor, lawyer, whoever, for multiple transactions. So whilst the fees may be lower and fixed, and there's no guarantee of success, ultimately it's a volume game that it's not a business owner that might sell their company once in a lifetime. You're looking to do multiple deals, and that's why they would do this. Another way of getting those professional fees on that sort of contingent fixed fee basis again is if you go back to your advisory board. If you've got a Big Four retired accountant, top 10 international retired corporate M&A lawyer on your advisory team, then them almost going to their contacts saying, this is what we're planning on doing, we're doing a roll-up, I'm involved, professional fees need to be deferred or on a success basis, then it's going to carry far more clout than if you go and approach somebody directly saying, can you do this on a sort of no sound no fee type basis. So what are the typical sort of fees involved? Depends on the complexity of the transaction. So I'll answer this question because Naz, I know you're based in the UK, so I'll answer it in sterling pounds. But it's very similar costs in other jurisdictions if you want to do the currency conversion. So a lawyer will cost you somewhere between 15 and 25 grand. In terms of a sort of one-off fee per transaction. If there's a real estate element involved where you need a specialist lawyer to deal with the sort of property side of things, then you can be looking at sort of between 2 and 5 grand for that. Accountants, if you don't have the knowledge or the expertise in-house and you're working with an external accountant that's going to help with the financial modelling and the sort of tax side of things, then you can be looking at maybe around about 5 grand. Audits for financiers, if they're not built into the transaction itself, then you might be looking at 3.5 to 5 grand, depending on transaction size. Professional valuations for plant and machinery and real estate can probably be somewhere between 2.5 and 5 grand. Lenders typically charge an arrangement fee, which can vary wildly depending on the type of funding you're looking at. It could be 5, 10 grand, it could be 100 grand. It really depends on the size of the lend. If you're using a finance broker, then you're probably looking at sort of 50 to 100, if not 150k for larger transactions. But those fees typically are contingent on success, and they're added to the loan. So you borrow enough to pay those professional fees. So they're the sort of typical costs, and you can expect to incur. A question from Sydney. Really great information. Will the recording be available? I lost internet for 20 minutes because of a storm nearby. Hi Sydney, greetings to you. I think you're in South Africa. So yes, we will share the recording with delegates that are on the call on the Zoom, and I will share with you the link for you to be able to download this afterwards. All I ask is that you don't share this with anybody else. It's just purely for your own purposes to be able to review in your own time. Anonymous attendee, would you be able to provide the financial analysis template, DD checklist, call objection sheet? Yes, sure, no problem. If you want to drop me an email, you obviously have my email because I will have emailed you. I'm not sure who you are because it says anonymous attendee, but if you drop me an email, I'll reply back with that. Question from Mark. EBIT contains tax. Is it correct that tax needs to be paid first and only the remaining sum can be used to repay the loan and deferred consideration? Yes, I mean, if you want to get technical about it in terms of the actual free cash flow, well, you know, if you go for net profit after tax and then add back depreciation, then essentially that's what your free cash flow is. That free cash flow is after you've paid your tax, after you've paid the interest on any debt servicing. But the way it works in reality and how lenders are typically looking at it is that, you know, they generally are looking at EBITDA. So whilst we may buy the business on a multiple of EBIT, not EBITDA, lenders are looking at EBITDA as that sort of free cash flow sum. So if you've got a business that's making let's say it's a UK business, I know you're based in the UK, Mark. Let's say it's making £1 million profit, then its corporation tax is probably going to be somewhere in the region of 250k, which leaves 750k left over to service your interest, your debt repayments, capital, as well as the interest, and any deferred consideration to the seller. And what you're really wanting to try and do is sort of keep that ratio of 70% of EBITDA is used as a maximum towards paying off all of those things. And obviously, using 70% leaves some left over for the tax bit. So I think that answers all the questions that we've had so far. Obviously, if there's any others that are now or crop up later, drop them in the box in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to answer them either throughout the next session or before we finish the live session today. So yeah, let's dive back into the slides and pick up where we left off before the break. So bear with. Okay, so before we just talk about growth post acquisition, I think let me just move some things around my screen. Yeah, just talking about completion day. Completion day is a little bit of an anticlimax because essentially everything that leads up to it, you know, actually on completion, it's really just more logistically of people signing things and funds being transferred. So what we typically tend to do when we get towards a completion date is we agree sort of, you know, time frame for when we're going to do this transaction. The lenders probably want to go and do some final checks, particularly around invoice finance. They're going to want to make sure that, you know, they understand the most recent ledger, what it is. They might want to verify some of the debt within the ledger, more recent stuff. And typically funds tend to get transferred the day or two before completion actually happening. So what you will tend to find is that the funds are released by the lender to the lender's lawyer. The lawyers then hold those funds on an undertaking, which essentially says until the lender gives the say-so, those funds can't be released. And then the lawyers will distribute the funds on completion to the relevant parties. So, you know, the seller, any professional fees, you know, anything that needs to go back into the company from a working capital point of view. Generally, there'll be some conditions in the SPA that need to be met before funding can be released. So normally in that undertaking, lawyers undertake with the lender to basically say, we'll confirm once all of these conditions are met. So they're obligated to do that. So we've done the deal. We're now going to talk about growth post acquisition, and we could do a whole seminar and session on all of this. So this is really just very high level information. If I'm honest, whilst it might seem quite extensive in terms of the process that you have to go through to finding and doing deals, this is actually the more straightforward part. There's deals everywhere. There's deals to be done. The challenging bit is actually once you own the company, you've got to do something with it. So generally, before we go into the acquisition, we'll have done our due diligence. We'll have a good understanding of the business. We will have identified where maybe the growth opportunities are. So what we're looking at is top line growth. How can we grow, the business? How can we generate more sales? How can we generate more revenue? We're looking at bottom line. So, what costs are in this business that could be eliminated, restructured? What could we save money on? And generally, ultimately you can pull levers in those things to, create a more profitable business. Top line growth tends to come from improvements in sales and marketing. If you're buying a baby boomer sort of, business, it's not uncommon for them to have created a business based on word of mouth. So they've got repeat customers. They're not very proactive with sales and marketing. So actually by introducing, proper structured, more improved marketing, better sales processes, all of those things could lead to, a better outcome. So sometimes I say it's better to sell to a customer that you've already got a relationship with, trying to find a new one. So, is there any cross-selling, upselling, downselling opportunities? What marketing could you do that could ultimately bring more revenue in, more sales opportunities? Having a proper structured sales process that, has follow-up in it, that communicates regularly with prospects, that deals with dead leads, that deals with cross-selling with people that buy from you. From a costs point of view, again, it's not uncommon for a baby boomer type generation business to have used the same supplier for many, many years, and they've got a good relationship and they've not shopped around. So one of the things that we would normally do is get our CFO to go in there and look at all of the lines on the P&L and figure out, do we need this? If we don't, then we chop it. If we do need it, is there a cheaper option out there, or is there an opportunity to get better value? And normally, if you follow that process, you can, in most businesses, you can grow top line by 5-10%, and you can save probably 5-10% on your, cost of sales and on your operating expenditure. You can also do some clever financial, re-engineering. So, you could adopt better credit control processes to ensure you get paid quicker by your customers. You might stretch out creditor days or negotiate extended creditor terms and conditions, which basically will release cash flow. Looking at inventory, is there any obsolete stock that should be sold off for cheap? Is there a process for almost ordering inventory in on time rather than holding it in your warehouse for many weeks or months? So looking at all of those things to ultimately release cash from obsolete assets, better improved debtors, creditors, etc. Looking at assets within the business that could be used or capitalized. So if you've got some valuable IP, could that be licensed out to other people? Are there any assets sitting around that aren't needed? It was an industrial business that we took over where we actually found that there was 3 vans, work vans, that were parked in the car park and had been parked there for 6 months and basically not used by anybody in the business. So we basically sold them. So sometimes all of this stuff might sound like really simple, straightforward stuff, but when you're a business owner that's run a business for many years, and maybe you're cash rich and very profitable and don't necessarily look at all of these things, fresh pair of eyes basically goes into look at all of these things. So let's just have a quick look at a business takeover checklist, so you can see some of the things that we look at. Yeah, so this is business takeover checklist. So, deal day, it's sort of, initial meeting with staff, reassurance, issuing a communication. Within the first month or so, we'll be looking at sort of getting a HR audit done. So we sort of almost do a questionnaire with staff to get their thoughts on what they like, what they don't like, where their areas of improvement are, updating all of the sort of key policies in regards to HR. From a finance point of view, very simple, straightforward stuff to start with, like getting on the bank mandate, getting access to their accounting software, making sure the invoice finance facility has been implemented, that we've got the right authorization processes in place for any expenditure. We're reviewing the credit control process. We're contacting all key stakeholders, banks, auditors, HMRC, tax authorities, et cetera, et cetera. Then over the first sort of month or so, we're meeting with all the sort of key stakeholders, suppliers, customers, auditors, accountants, et cetera, et cetera. Legal, making sure all of the sort of appropriate filings are done with the company registry, so ASIC in Australia, the relevant state authority in the US or Companies House in the UK, making sure any charges are all registered and where stamp duty or taxes are applicable on the transaction that they're dealt with and paid. Then over the first sort of 90 days, it's refining the business plan. You may well have put a business plan, of course, together for the transaction, but, sitting down with the management, actually owning the company and looking at things will create refinements, and you can refine the financial model off the back of it, and making sure you've got your SOPs documented, sales, marketing, financial processes, and then general sort of stuff, sort of more admin-y type stuff. So that really is more sort of practical stuff rather than growth stuff. But yeah, there's a sort of comprehensive list there of all of the things that we typically tend to look at, and then the hard work starts in terms of how do we improve the sales and marketing and the financial re-engineering and the bottom line growth, to get a better result out of the company. So on to people. I mentioned that one of the red flags from our perspective, and there's nothing wrong if you have a different perspective to this, but we will not buy a business that does not come without a capable leader or management team after the owner leaves. And the principal risk from our perspective is if it's an owner operated business where they've got the relationships with staff, customers, suppliers, and yes, they might do a handover period and leave within 6 or 12 months, you've got to replace them. The person that you replace them with, if they don't exist in the business, then even if they have a strong track record in competitors or other businesses, they don't have specific experience of running this particular business, which will have its own culture, its own relationships, and it's quite hard for somebody new that's never been in this organization to break into those things. Whenever I've bought a business where the owner's leaving and there isn't a capable person, we've had to recruit somebody to take over. It's only ever really worked productively when we've already owned several businesses in that industry, where we've got resources in other companies that could be shared across the piece, rather than recruiting a brand new MD from that industry to take over a business that they've never ran before. It just creates huge risk. So whilst some people might be comfortable with that, that's fine. It's not one for us. So, we want to make sure that we've got the right people in play. If there are any gaps in the leadership team, then we want to make sure that is plugged accordingly by recruiting people. And we, what we tend to find in a lot of sort of owner, sort of baby boomer type businesses is that, maybe they've got a capable MD, but maybe they tend to be more reactive with their accounting and finance side of things. So bringing in a good CFO is probably more straightforward than trying to bring in a brand new MD that's not got to just run the business, but also shape the future strategy. A CFO that's just got to bring the numbers to life and make sure the right processes are in place to ensure that we've got real-time data that we can make decisions on is probably a more straightforward recruit than finding that MD. So what we would look to do is bring in the right people. We would recruit those people through our own networks, asking the business owner, all of those sorts of things. LinkedIn is a very good, I suppose, platform for this sort of stuff, and you can make approaches to people. So just bear with me 1 second. I just need to swap out my audio because my batteries are running out in my iPod, so bear with me.
Okay, we'll go back into the slides now. Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned before was sort of working with an advisory board. Particularly if you've never done a deal before, you don't have any sort of track record within, either doing deals or within your specific industry. My recommendation would be to build an advisory board. So that probably starts with a chairperson, somebody that's got 30, 40 years experience in your industry, been there, done it, worn the t-shirt, probably got some M&A experience, probably things that they don't know about the industry aren't worth knowing. Probably want somebody of equal stature on the finance side of things. So maybe a big four trained accountant, CFO, retired accountant, semi-retired person that you can bring on board. Probably also look at a legal person. So top 10 corporate M&A lawyer, semi-retired, retired. Those three people are quite powerful because when you go and talk to sellers, when you go and talk to banks, being able to say, look, this is my dream team, this is my chairman, this is what he's done before, this is my CFO, this is what she's done before, this is my legal expert, this is that person's um, background and track record. All of those things are very powerful in not just convincing the seller, because part of the thing with the seller is not just getting the financial components of the deal right, but they've got to trust that you know what you're doing. You're going to, their money's safe in terms of the deferred, that you're going to handle their legacy well. Well, if you've got, exceptionally talented people that have been there, done it, worn the t-shirt many times before you, then that will go a long way into reassuring the seller. And it's exactly the same from the bank's perspective. Asking your bank for money when you're not putting any of your own in, not signing any PG, but the fact that you've got a world-class team behind you will give the lender far more confidence than if it's just you, where you've not done this before and this is your first rodeo. So let's talk about exits. So again, this session today really was really about how you find and do deals more so than what you do with them once you own them and building up towards that exit. It would be wrong of me to not include a short bit about exits here because ultimately that's what we're all working towards. But this could be a whole section in itself. I did write a book on this subject called Built to Sell Well. You can pick it up at Amazon. And essentially, I've bought, built, and sold several groups. So the first book I wrote in 2023 called Buy, Build, Sell charts my first sort of 2 decades in business of buying, building, and selling companies. I then wrote in 2024 the book Leveraged Buyouts, which you will have all been provided with a copy of before you attended this seminar today, which sort of maps out the process in detail, sort of what we've done today in today's session about how to actually go out and find and do these types of deals. Well, the next book that I wrote in 2025 was Built to Sell Well. So we've spoken today about, we're looking for baby boomer businesses where, they typically transact at a 2.5 times multiple. Well, what can you do to maximize your exit and ultimately get a better multiple than 2.5 times? Well, if you have a read of my book, Built to Sell Well, it sort of walks you through the process in quite some detail about how to do that. So if I was looking to sell a group that I've put together, essentially what I'd be looking to do is firstly, most companies, there are a few sectors where this isn't applicable, but the vast majority sell for a multiple of EBITDA. So what we first want to do is maximize that EBITDA. So we can do that practically by, putting several companies together, consolidating, removing duplicated head office functions to create those economies of scale, the buying power to improve margins and all those sorts of things. But also we can look at items within the business that potentially could be capitalized. So, most of the time you pay your accountant to reduce your profits because that reduces your tax liability. When you're selling a business, which most business owners tend to overlook, is you actually want to do the opposite. You want to declare as much profit as possible, because if companies sell for a multiple of profit, the higher that profit, the higher the exit value. You then want to make yourself redundant from the business, so you really don't want to be getting involved in the day to day. So you shouldn't be dealing with staff, customers, operations. You almost need to be the shareholder. So you've got your board of directors that run the company day to day. You're a shareholder that they report to and keep you posted as to how things are going. You have absolutely no if or little input into the business. You want to make yourself redundant so you can demonstrate to buyers that this business runs with or without without you. You want to make yourself saleable. So I would basically make sure all of my processes are documented. So your standard operating procedures, sales, marketing, finance, operations. You then want to build a data room. So you make your due diligence exercise easy for buyers. You make yourself buyable, if you like, if that's a word. So, all of that data room that we spoke about before for when you're looking to come in and buy a company, you also build one for when you exit. So, once you've signed an NDA with a potential buyer, you can give them access to the data room and everything's in one place, and it makes it easy for them to review rather than having to work through that process. When the time comes, you basically get it all sorted and organized beforehand. I then write a long list of all of the people that this might be suitable for. So, I'm thinking of my competitors, my supply chain, private equity backed operators, people in other geographies or territories that might want to get into your market. So, one of the businesses I built in the private hire sector, we ultimately exited to a private equity firm based in Singapore that wanted to get into the UK market. So, yeah, looking for all sorts of options. Possibly taking a group public could be a way to potentially looking at exit, selling it to your management team, and getting them private equity backing to fund all of that. Or just selling out to trade. So yeah, you want to basically maximize the profit result. You want to get as many horses in the race, because ultimately if you've got two or three offers to choose from, that gives you more choice than just having one, and it enables you to negotiate and I suppose play one off against the other. So on to your strategy then. So whether this is your, potential first deal or whether you've already done multiple deals, for me, the recommendation that I would have, I mean, today we've talked practically about the process of, how you use a marketing process to find the right opportunity, and then the sales process of how you convince that seller to do the deal and all of the stuff in between. My strong recommendation would be following that strategy with a niche. And that niche is based on your expertise, contacts, passions. So, if you've worked in an industry for 10, 20 years, if you've owned a business in a particular sector, if you've got contacts in a particular sector, if you're passionate about something, then it's far easier to go and engage and have those initial conversations with business owners where you've been there and worked in that industry. You're going to know the same sorts of people, you're going to talk the same language. Some of my first deals were I spent 7 years running and building a recruitment business. So one of my first transactions post doing that was buying up a recruitment business. I'd also worked in the real estate sector, so I did several deals in the real estate sector. It was far more straightforward for me to go and have conversations with business owners where I talked their language. And whilst we've now done deals in 32 different industries, and it becomes more of a generic conversation, if I'm getting into a new industry, I would never go into a new industry without having a credible industry expert by my side. So a lot of the deals that we do tend to be on a joint venture basis. So we bring the M&A expertise to the table, which is generic across many industries, and we have an industry expert or partner that ultimately fully understands that industry, the business model, the contacts, etc., etc. So when you combine those two things together, you probably got more chance of executing more successfully than if I tried to go and do deals in a sector I've got no experience in, or equally if an industry operator wanted to go and do some deals but had never done any M&A before. So it's really about bringing different skills and value to the party. So my suggestion would be, if you're starting out with this, is to think about your industry. Go out and research, is it big enough? Does the LBO model work? In terms of sort of funding. And then I would also be looking at, you want to probably stay away from capital intensive businesses. At the end of the day, you're using your free cash flow to service this transaction. So if you've then got big capital expenditure, or, your cash is tied up in operations, then the LBO model, whilst it can still be made to work, tends to be less attractive from a seller's point of view, because you're using more of your cash to service the business as well as the debt. So probably in terms of what you can pay the seller will be lower, which might mean that they're obviously not keen on on the transaction. So yeah, think long and hard about your strategy, your industry, build a plan for doing that outreach. Sense check that actually if you go off and do this and buy and build and ultimately sell, that you are going to be able to be sold. So have a look to see are there acquirers here, who's buying businesses in this space, what are they looking for, what multiples are larger groups typically tending to trade for, and then work back from there. Really, you come up with, right, I'm going to do a buy and build in this industry. I'm going to make it this big, 5 companies, 100 million revenue, 10 million EBITDA, and you then come up with a sourcing strategy off the back of it. As I said, when we started out today, around about 1,000 cold outreach is sort of what you probably aim for over a 3-4 month period. That will give you enough responses to get your first deal agreed, and also one in the pipeline for the future when you go and look at your revisit pile, because not all of those opportunities will be right now, but that doesn't mean to say that they won't transact in 12 or 18 months time. And then it's really a rinse and repeat, creating that habit, making sure that week in, week out, sourcing happens. If sourcing happens, you've got an inflow of leads. Even if those leads aren't great quality, that's a problem that can easily be fixed by filtering the data better. But if you don't do the sourcing, you're not going to get your diary full of opportunities. And I think that, there are sometimes people that attend these seminars where, for me, knowledge is nothing without application. So, most people, intelligent people, can see how this process comes together and can be made to work. But if you don't take action, then you're not going to sit here with a deal. If this is not your first rodeo, maybe you've done deals before. I hope that this has brought some clarity to, maybe using the leverage buyout structure as a way to complement what you've already done before, and ultimately build upon what what you've done, and seeing if you can, do multiple more deals as you go on the journey. So just a few other documents that I'd like to share to show you. Let me just come out of these slides. So I'm only very quickly going to flick through some of these, but yeah, we've got some documents here that can help. So this is a board composition. So, typically in most acquisitions, we'll have an MD, which is usually somebody that's already in the business that deals with the day-to-day. We'll probably have a non-exec that will represent our interests. So this could be a chairman, it could be just a non-exec, an independent board advisor. We want to make sure that there's a finance director. So yeah, finance director and MD tends to be the executive committee. As we go on the buy and build and it becomes bigger, then maybe we might need a marketing director, a HR director, an ops director, a commercial director. But to start with, an MD and an FD is enough, and an NED to sort of manage our, interests, because we're very much in this as a shareholder rather than somebody that's going to get involved in the day to day. Next document to show you. Yeah, this is just a quick sort of overview. If you can get deferred consideration insurance, so whilst this document specifically relates to UK deals, the same thing can be arranged in most other jurisdictions, including the USA, Canada, and Australia. And essentially, you can get insurance that can protect against the non-payment of deferred. So one of the biggest things and objections that you'll find from sellers is, are you going to pay them when you say you're going to pay them? Well, they can arrange, aside from everything that we've spoken about today in terms of managing that risk, one thing that they could also do is organise deferred consideration insurance. Now, it's basically insurance protects the seller against the risk. And there'll be certain criteria, like with all insurance, about to qualify, etc. You've got to have a certain criteria, etc., and how to follow claims and stuff like that. Let's not beat around the bush. This is not cheap. It tends to be a percentage of the actual deferred consideration. So, if you've got 10 million seller note, it's probably going to cost you high six figures to insure that. So it's not for everybody, but it's just another tool that I suppose you could put in the toolkit to enable you to do transactions. Um, So whilst we spoke today about using your own marketing strategy to do deals, one way to do this will be to find introducers, people that are connected to business owners that potentially could refer you. So this is not brokers. This is not people that are going to sort of be a middle person, if you like, and earn some sort of introductory commission from the seller as well. You want independent parties that potentially could introduce you to suitable people. So like this is just a standard referral fee agreement that says, if you introduce me a deal that ultimately goes somewhere, then we'll pay you a fee. What are those typical fees? Well, generally we tend to just have a fixed fee. Maybe it's 10 grand, maybe it's 25 grand, depending on the size of the transaction. Maybe it's a percentage, maybe you even pay them in equity. Obviously it just depends on what you decide to uh, agree. I think that's probably, there's probably just one other thing that's probably worth me sharing with you. So I mentioned before that knowledge is nothing without application, but I also think that accountability is a big thing. One of the things that I wish I knew back in the day when I was doing my first deals was I should have probably hired a mentor. So when I built my recruitment business, I left an industry that had a very high paid, successful job, decided to go into a brand new industry where I saw a niche, thought I knew everything, didn't, spent 3 months messing around and not really getting it. And then I found someone that had been there, done it, worn the t-shirt, built a very successful recruitment business. And I'd basically learned from him, paid him as a mentor to guide me through the process. And he was probably critical, fundamental really to me building that successful recruitment business. Part of it was not just knowledge, but also holding me accountable, agreeing actions every week and making sure that I delivered them. And I guess it's a bit like, if people want to lose weight, well, you all know that you've got to eat healthy, go to the gym, work out, all of those sorts of things. But actually, if you've got nobody holding you accountable, then you've got potentially it's not going to work. So if you look at these sort of health programs like Weight Watchers and stuff, people have to turn them every week and get weighed, and if they don't lose weight, then it's a bit embarrassing standing up there and saying, hey, I didn't. And then creating the habits, making sure the refrigerator is stocked with healthy fruit and vegetables, making sure that there's time in the diary to visit the gym, and doing deals is no different. Ultimately it's about creating the habits. The habits really are making sure that sourcing is done, so it's set up week in, week out, and it's a better problem to have where you've got too many leads than not enough. So one of the things I found some people struggle with is that they set everything up, they start to get momentum, they start to get loads of leads, almost they become a little bit inundated where they feel a bit overwhelmed that they're getting so many calls from people. But you've just got to keep doing that, because if you stop, it's a bit like being a management consultant. You market yourself to get your contract, you go and do the work, the project, and then you finish the project and then you've got no work, so you have to do the whole marketing again, and it takes time to build that momentum. You're better to create that momentum and make sure it remains, so week in, week out, without fail, you do enough sourcing to generate you enough leads that you can cope with. And then the accountability piece, either find a mentor, you can work with somebody like me or my partners, or you can sort of hold yourself accountable. So this is an example of a countdown board where you literally, put in at the start of the month what your target is. So I'm going to do 1,000 outreach this month, and then you record how many you do every single day, and it'll work out, how many you've got left to go. So hopefully by the end of the month you can tick off, yep, I've done my goal there. I've achieved that. And obviously, if you're behind, you can see, and it's very visual and it's all color coded as well. So it sort of shows you whether you're on track or not on track. So I think that's probably all of the other documents that I wanted to share. Let's go back into the slides. Before we do, let's just have a look. I think there might be a few more questions. Let's have a look. Um, So, question from Gabriel. Hi, Gabriel. Hi, Paul. I know you JV with certain people. What sort of packages do you offer? Is the one where I can bring a deal and you can help me with funding? When we dive back into the slides, I'll probably answer that question for you. But yeah, we can certainly help you with, not just parts of the process, but all of the process. We can certainly help with raising funding. Um, one of the businesses that we refer to is Finance for Business, where they'll basically help people that know what they're doing organize the funding. So yeah, always happy to make introductions to people that want to do deals and need help with stuff. Next question, Gabriel. Again, how do you prepare the existing management for life post LBOs, as there will be more responsibility and likely less cash in the bank? Yeah. So this is this. I'll give you an example actually of a deal that we completed just a couple of weeks ago. It's a construction business, roughly 10 million turnover, million profit, always run with, at least a million in the bank. So it's always been cash rich. And I think when you're in a business like that, having such a sum of money in the bank, you almost don't need to think about bills when they come in. You get a bill, you sign the check, you pay the bill, you move on to the next one. And, it's not going to really have much of a dent in your bank account. But the way that this deal was structured was essentially that working capital was replaced with invoice finance, and some of the surplus cash was used to fund the actual transaction itself. So it means that the business now has only 300k in the bank at probably any one time. So it actually needs to think about how it manages cash flow differently. So the way that we've managed that is we, before the deal was actually done, is we sent the CFO, that's sort of acting as a non-exec in this is an Australian deal. CFO's gone in, looked at their processes, coached the sort of senior team on the accounts person on, what things are going to look like post transaction. So it's partly managing process, partly setting expectations, so that actually when we take over, there's no surprises. Everybody knows. All parties were involved in the financial modelling, so they knew how working capital was going to change and how things would look post transaction. So I think it's partly communication and setting those expectations actually before you do the deal. Rather than sort of going in after the deal's done and saying, hey, we're going to have to run things differently. I mean, changes, nobody likes change even when it's for the better, and it's really about how you manage that change. And I think again, I know we've gone through a lot of stuff today, whereby this is the long process, but actually this is the easy part. Finding and doing the deal is the easy part. It's the what you do once you own the thing. How do you manage the business? How do you drive it forward? How do you oversee it? How all of those sorts of things. And that can be quite challenging, particularly when a business has been owner operated and ran a certain way for so long, and you're looking to come in and change some stuff, like how you manage cash flow. It's really about how you manage that change. So it's really about setting expectations, explaining the reasons why, getting people on board with the journey, bringing in the expertise to support that transition, so that everybody is yeah, hopefully on the same page. And another question, Sydney, Paul, you mentioned that you sent a link to your book. Please, could you resend? Yep, sure, no problem. I'll sort that out from after this. So yeah, let's go back into the slides. We're almost done now. So yeah, I just want to talk about, just picking up really on Gabriel's point about people and how they could potentially work with us if they're really serious about doing deals. I mean, hopefully you found the content and that useful today. And I think everything I've shared with you, if you go out and implement, this is a process that's tried and tested, not just by me, but by many deal makers around the world. They use this process day in, day out to buy multiple companies. You don't have to joint venture with us, but there are opportunities to do so. So I'll walk you through very quickly what that looks like if people are interested to sort of take this a step further, and then we'll just dive into the final sort of summary and any final Q&A before we wrap things up today. So yeah, if people are interested to work with me one-on-one, you can have a look at paulseabridgeconsulting.com. And essentially, the slides of bear with me. Just come back into the slide. Sorry about that. Yeah, so essentially, I work with people on a one-on-one basis. I only take 5 people on at any particular point in time, where we'll basically work together one-on-one With me, my team will support that process, but this is basically getting me somebody that's done over 100 transactions in 32 different industries, and we create a blueprint together to ultimately go out and do deals together. So we'll basically walk through the process one on one. So we'll work together on sourcing off market opportunities for your industry niche, finding those direct to seller opportunities. We'll make sure that you're positioned credibly as a buyer, not just in terms of how we've spoken about this today, but I guess also utilizing our own credibility. So the fact that you're working with somebody that's done over 100 deals, some of the people that will be part of the team who have also done, you know, nine figures worth of deals, the case studies of other deals that we've done. I think that goes a long way because it's then not just you telling a seller what they want to hear, you're actually sharing with them other people that have done deals. And then we'll work one on one through the process. So we'll, yeah, speak to business owners together. We'll refine your approach. We'll structure the offers so that they get accepted. We'll raise the funding together once the deal is agreed, and we'll navigate the whole sort of due diligence, legal completion, and closing process. And the idea is that we build enough momentum to do multiple acquisitions rather than just sort of one off. A few examples. Steve acquired a 11 million revenue construction business in the UK back in 2020. Well, yeah, this time last year actually, 2025, February 2025, and he's gone on to buy several other companies along the way. Taj closed a 30 million revenue construction group. David went out into the transportation industry and did multiple acquisitions. So all very different people, but basically following the same roadmap. And I guess, look, most people tend to fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they ultimately fail to implement things correctly. You know, people take courses, but they don't execute. They'll say the wrong things to sellers. They'll kill deals with maybe poor structuring. They'll approach banks at maybe the wrong time, or they'll lose confidence when things get difficult. And I guess what's different about working with me is that, you know, we have got a track record. We've done over 100 transactions in many different industries, in many different countries. We've raised over $500 million worth of capital. I'm a best-selling author, and I speak regularly around the world on the experience of M&A. And I guess that it's that raw experience, not just when things are going well, but also when deals don't go to plan. I think that's what creates those results. So yeah, working one-on-one with me is, you know, it's basically private coaching with me. We'll have regular working sessions. You'll have access to my personal WhatsApp. We'll, you know, have a live deal strategy that will be constantly in review. You'll have all of my knowledge, expertise, and resource to go out and raise the capital. Not just that, but also access to my global network, which includes almost 800 private high net worth investors around the world. So we've spoken today very much about debt funding, but actually accessing high net worth investors for equity capital can sometimes be the difference in bridging the gap between a deal that wasn't going to work to one that actually can be made to work. So we'll bring those that access to that network, and we create that sort of deal partnership so that we're aligned. And you know, it's very much high touch, high commitment, high value. So yeah, if it resonates with you, drop me a mail, or you can yeah, visit paulseabridgeconsulting.com and book a call, and we can chat through whether or not we're you know, the right fit to yeah, work together. Let me just dive back into the slides properly. So that really sort of brings us towards a close today. So yeah, if there's any final questions, anybody wants to ask anything specific about anything that we've covered today, please use the Q&A box, and I'll pick up those any final questions, if any. So before we do that, let me just sort of summarize. Yeah, so you know, this is a sales and marketing process. Marketing to find your deal, sales to ultimately convince the business owner to sell you the transaction and convince the bank to give you the money to do the transaction. It's about following a very structured process. So, you know, having those first meetings where you start to add a filter. So you deliver some key messages around, you know, how you do deals, how you structure things, that you use a, you know, limited liability company as the SPV, that you use debt to fund the transaction, that you don't pay all of the funding at all of the purchase price at closing, that there's always going to be some degree of seller finance, and the reasons why. You're getting across those key messages in the first, second, and subsequent meetings. You're reminding the seller at every point, so that ultimately, when it comes comes to making that financial proposal, nothing's a surprise. You're not hiding anything. You've already told them how you do deals, why you do them that way, so that look, if they're not comfortable with anything, they'll fall out of the process. And it means that any meetings you have, constantly getting more serious and more motivated, ultimately to enter into a transaction. We've spoken about objection handling. So, the typical objections you tend to get around valuation, wanting more upfront, wanting a shorter deferred period, and how linking that back to those key messages and setting of expectations that you had in those first and subsequent meetings, and how, you can link all of that back to the affordability and viability of the business, and using logic like bringing up your spreadsheet and showing them what's affordable and what's not. I've shared with you obviously how we analyze deals. So, in a traditional leverage buyout, we're leveraging the assets of the business. We can borrow 70, 80, 90% of invoice receivables, 50 to 70% against real estate, 33 to 75% of plant and equipment, and how we use EBITDA, no more than 70% of EBITDA to structure the deal in terms of the repayment of, both financial institutions, but also any seller notes, so that it's affordable and viable and everybody can feel comfortable with things. Once we've done that analysis, we've presented them with a ballpark financial proposal. We then entered into some maybe discussions, negotiations around how we tweak things to make it more fitting for them. And then we've gone through how we present the offer ultimately so that we get a yes. So we do a professional presentation, detailed deck where we're focusing on the core components, which is us as a buyer, that we're a safe pair of hands, we're building on their legacy, what we're going to do with the business, our expertise, our track record, things we've done before. We've then spoken about the actual financial components of the deal, so how the deal's structured, so it's all out there, clarified, and we've explained to them the metrics that we use to come up with the proposal, and then we've closed them for the next steps. Once the deal's agreed, we bind it in a term sheet, which is the roadmap that we hand over to the lawyers to get the deal done, which really captures the core components like purchase price, deal structure, funding, warranties, all of the sort of contentious issues that might be raised in the legal process. We try and box off in the term sheet, so if there are any issues later on, we can point back to that, and basically show people that we've already agreed this. So, why are we talking about it? Fundraising starts before we even embark on this process. Once you decide what your industry is going to be and that you're going to go on a buy and build, you've already engaged with banks, you've spoken with them, you've sussed them out about their criteria, what they look for. When you've then got the deal and you've put it together in line with what the lender's criteria typically is, and then you can go back to them and ideally take your dream team. If it's me you're working with, then obviously I'll bring that dream team with me. If you're building your own advisory board, then you're taking some exceptional people that basically allay any of the lender's fears, and you're asking intelligent questions along the way to make sure that they fully feel comfortable with you, that you've considered all outcomes, you've stress tested the deal, so what if scenarios, and that gives them more confidence. We've walked you through the due diligence exercise, so that's really used to understand the business better, so that we're going in with our eyes open, and then you're also going in to identify risks, and then either you're not comfortable with those risks, so you walk away, or you mitigate those risks within the legal, so warranty protections, indemnities, etc., etc. Walk through the legal process. The key thing really here is making sure that you're working with pragmatic advisors, educating the seller on the process, and making sure that if we are going to get stuck in some of the legal areas, that it's really in the areas that matter, like the warranties, rather than whether you put a full stop at the end of the sentence. We've then covered, just from a high level point of view today, about growth post acquisition. So how we can grow the top line with better sales and marketing, getting more from existing customers. Selling to existing customers is easier than looking for new ones. Improved marketing to generate better sales inquiries, proper structured sales processes to convert more of what you bring through the front door as a potential customer lead. Bottom line growth by looking at cost base and whether there are better deals out there, whether you're getting value for money, whether there are costs that could be cut, whether there's consolidation to happen. So yeah, that's the process, I suppose, in summary. Start to finish, and that basically brings us to a close. I'll deal with any Q&A if we've got any, but yeah, really the next steps for you are to take action. Knowledge is nothing without application. Create those habits every week and you'll be well on your way to going out and hopefully doing multiple deals. And for anybody that's interested in partnering with me on that one-on-one basis, as I say, visit paulseabridgeconsulting.com, and we can hop on a call and have a chat about your M&A journey, what you've done so far, profile, what you're looking to do, and whether or not there's a way of us potentially partnering with each other. So yeah, let's just have a look if there's any Q&A. Um, so Naz, you have a question. Re-exits. Do you ever retain a business long term or indefinitely rather than pursuing an exit? If so, under what circumstances? Yeah, so look, I mean, our model is buy, build, sell. We buy a business, we build it, and we sell it, and it's basically rinse and repeat. Um, I don't think you get rich from owning a business. Yes, you can earn some good money along the way. You can earn dividends, management fees, etc., etc. But the big paydays come when you actually exit. Ultimately, you might earn, if things go to plan, you execute well, maybe six figures whilst owning the business, but ultimately you can create seven, if not eight figure exits, and that's really where the big payday comes. So, when's the best time to sell a business? Well, as far as I'm concerned, anything I'm involved in, is always up for sale. There's some businesses that I had offers for before the COVID pandemic, and I should have taken them, and then COVID almost decimated them, and then we've had to spend 2 or 3 years building them back up. Nobody foresaw COVID coming along, and hindsight's a wonderful thing and all of that sort of stuff. So is it better to take a decent offer now than maybe work another 3 or 5 years for something that might be even better, but no guarantee of getting there? So yeah, the idea is to sort of spend probably a 3 to 5 year time frame in an industry, buying, building, selling, and then rinse and repeat, move on to the next one. The longest I've ever been involved in a group is 7 years. So, sometimes we do keep hold of them and work a bit longer. But most of the time it tends to be a sort of 2 to 5 year plan, really. The next question from Naz is exit always part of the strategy for every acquisition? What are the key triggers that would prompt the sale? Yeah, it's really just following the process today. We buy the business, we then consolidate it with other tactical and strategic acquisitions, and we basically drive the economies of scale, the cross-selling opportunities. We really drive things hard. We want to maximize that EBITDA. The longer that we do that and prove that and build the business, then the more valuable it becomes. And it's trying to strike the balance between when's the best time to sell. So you could put together 4 or 5 companies and then sell them immediately, but you probably get a low multiple for that. Whereas if you own them for 1 or 2 years afterwards, and you can demonstrate the things that you've done to improve the profitability and also the future growth of the business by joining them together, then that potentially gives you a better outcome in terms of the value that you may sell for. Have you ever exited a business ahead of a sector decline? I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. Yeah, so one of the first acquisitions we were ever involved in was in the real estate sector, which can be quite cyclical, and it can be very much based on the economic climate at the time. There's peaks and troughs for every property market. So probably maybe not my example, but a really good example of this would be Foxtons, which is probably one of the best known, if not the best known, brand names in the real estate agency industry. They're a real estate agency with multiple branches across London, founded by a guy called John Hunt, who's a billionaire. He started up the business, I think it was Notting Hill or Kensington, one office, and then built a very, 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 very successful business. And he sold that in 2007, literally months before the financial crisis at the time. So very much sold at the peak of the market. I think it's always very difficult to be able to predict these things. I mean, economists get paid a lot of money, but in my experience, they never seem to agree. And it's always easy for one person to have a different opinion to the other, and it can be argued either way. So I think all we can focus on is the model works. We buy a business, we build it, we join it with other tactical and strategic acquisitions. So even in a downturn, you can usually improve the profits of these businesses by unlocking those synergies of economies of scale, buying power, etc., etc. So yeah, it's really about following that process. And if we can find a way of timing it with a peak of a market, great. But I think in reality, it doesn't really work like that. Have you ever disposed of a business at a loss? Yes, absolutely. So not necessarily losing our own money, but yeah, using, if you leverage a business, you can sell it off later on, and as long as the bank's covered, then I guess it's okay. Back in the day, so this is sort of early 2010s, 2012, 2013, we played around quite a lot in the sort of distressed space. So sometimes when you take on a distressed business, sometimes things don't always work out as you want them to. So sometimes you have to exit from that. You have to find a different route of disposing of things. So yes, we have. But the idea is to win more than you lose, and this is why we focus very much on the leverage buyout type structure because it means we can acquire well-run, consistently profitable businesses. A business that's been around since the 1980s or 1990s, year in, year out, churns out a decent profit with a good management team in place. Just because there's a change of ownership, those things are more likely to continue because it's been around for such a long time, achieving those things with the right people. So yeah, we would very, very, very much sort of follow that model rather than sort of, I mean, you can make money in the distress space, but it's not for us. Um, Broadly, how would you describe your overall success or failure rate across investments? So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you get from working with me is, whilst we've got it right more times than we've got it wrong, there have been deals that haven't gone to plan, and I think that expertise is quite crucial because, deals never pan out as you want them to. There's always something that will go wrong or change, and sometimes it can be minuscule and easy to resolve, and sometimes it can be much more fundamental. So I think when you're working with somebody that's got that level of expertise, you'll hear from me, instead of doing this, maybe do this instead because I've done that before, is far more valuable than maybe coming up with a suggestion of what might work. We're proving, look, we've done this before. This is what happened when we did that. This is what happened when we did this, and this is what the outcome was. Next question, Sydney. Thank you for the event. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Well worth it for me. Well, thanks, Sydney. Yeah, glad you found it useful. Mark, Paul, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll email you privately, so I'm keen to continue our last conversation to do a JV together. Yeah, great. Look forward to hearing from you, Mark. Um, Adrian, what sort of industries are you looking at going forward in 26 and 27? So I think our model is very much sector agnostic. There are some industries where maybe it doesn't work or doesn't work as well. This works really well where the industry is highly fragmented, so lots of operators that potentially could be consolidated. It works well when there's an asset base to fund from, and as I said before, common to belief. It's not just about, heavy industry businesses where they've got expensive factories and machinery that you can fund against. Actually, it's easier to do a deal in the B2B service industry. So recruitment, facilities management, cleaning companies, HVAC, all of those are, really popular industries that this is ripe for. And then ultimately you're looking for if you're going to build a group that somebody's actually going to go and buy you. So I would probably throw the question back at you to, I don't know what sector you're in, Adrian, but have a look at your industry or industries that you've worked in, got experience in, maybe done deals in if you've done deals before, and look at what's fragmented, where can the model be deployed from an LBO perspective, and if you end up building something, who will buy you? And as long as those things come together, then I think it would work. I think what we're seeing quite, some interesting things going on. Healthcare, I think, is a big one. Regardless of whether, you know, Donald Trump is putting tariffs up or, we're at war with different countries or whatever's happening in the world, change of governments, more taxes, more regulations. There's always challenges out there regardless. And I think that, there are some industries that are recession proof. We're in a world where, population is growing. It's an aging population. Healthcare is becoming, more and more. So, if you look in the US, I know lots of people that are sort of, rolling up in the sort of assisted living space. Down under in Australia, there's, very fragmented industries with like dental practices, occupational therapy, podiatrists, and there's all these sort of little small clinics that when they operate from multi-sites, they're not owner operated, and there's opportunities to maybe consolidate there, and there's always going to be a demand for those things regardless of whether in an economic boom or an economic bust. And yeah, B2B service industries, we're seeing quite a lot of interesting stuff going on. Facilities management, HR, staffing, recruitment seems to be very acquisitive. Yeah. So yeah, have a look at maybe some of those. Next question, Gabriel. Thanks, Paul. Really informative. Great. Glad you found it useful, Gabriel. Adrian agreed on need healthcare, food. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Recession-proof industries are always a good one because there's always going to be a demand for them, regardless of what economic cycle we're in, or political environment, or macroeconomic climate. So cool. Any other questions at all before we finish up today? Please drop them in the comment box. If not, then I think we'll wrap things up. So okay, well yeah, thanks everybody for attending. I'm glad for the people that have said that they found it really useful. Glad you did. And as I say, if anybody's interested in sort of chatting about one-on-one and how we can maybe work together, then do reach out. Otherwise, I wish you happy deal making.